Story 1. Ledgers and rice, the daily grind of Ming Dynasty tax collectors. You close your eyes and imagine yourself not in a battlefield, not in the grand halls of an emperor, but in a dusty county office somewhere in the vast Ming Dynasty. The years stretch from the late 14th century through the 17th, and across China, tax collectors are the overlooked machinery that keep the empire's great wheel turning. While emperors issued proclamations in booming voices and generals marched with banners fluttering, these clerks spent their days bent over wooden desks, dipping brushes into ink, recording grain owed and labor promised. Their world was not one of glory, but of rice, land, paper, and obligation. The Ming Dynasty rose after the collapse of the Mongol Yuan dynasty, founded by Zhu Yuanzhang, the Hongwu emperor, in 1368. His distrust of elites and his desire to control the empire directly through the throne produced one of the largest bureaucracies the world had yet seen. At its heart lay taxation. Grain and rice formed the lifeblood of the state, feeding both armies and palace alike. Without collection, no empire could survive. Yet tax collection was rarely a matter of grand gestures. It was an act of endless repetition, measurement, and careful recording. A day in the office. A county tax collector in the Ming era might begin his day at dawn. The office, usually a hall of modest size, open to farmers waiting outside with questions, petitions, or payments. Ledgers were stored on wooden shelves, tied together with string, each volume heavy with names. Every household in the county was listed, with obligations carefully noted. The tax was often due in kind: rice, wheat, or cloth. For some, corvée labor replaced grain. The clerk's brush moved slowly, line by line, verifying names, cross-checking entries against village headmen's reports. The air smelled faintly of ink and old paper. The sound of writing was soft, brush against bamboo slips or paper scrolls, punctuated by murmurs from farmers as their obligations were confirmed. To you, sitting quietly in the corner, it feels like nothing happens here, and yet everything does, for the empire depends on these tiny confirmations of obligation. The weight of the grain tax. The Ming taxation system was famously complex. Households were registered in a system known as the ligia, which organized families into groups of 10 and 100, with responsibilities rotating among them. The grain tax formed the backbone of state revenue. It was heavy, especially in regions fertile with rice paddies. Farmers trudged along dirt roads carrying sacks to state granaries, where clerks tallied weight against obligation. Grain had to be measured carefully, not only for fairness but for survival. Too much claimed by the state meant villages starved, too little, and soldiers could not be fed. The tax collector's office, therefore, was both feared and resented, but also essential. Farmers might mutter about corruption or unfair burdens, but they returned year after year because life itself revolved around these obligations. The bureaucrats, too, bore the weight of this responsibility. A miscalculation, a missing record could draw suspicion, even punishment. In the Ming state, errors in tax records could cost careers or lives. Ledgers as quiet power. The true power of the Ming state lay not in its armies but in its ledgers. Imagine a farmer in Jiangsu province. His family's name appears in neat brushstrokes on a page tied together with silk thread. Next to it, the size of his fields, the expected yield, the portion owed. This quiet entry defined his year. His harvest might be bountiful or meager, but the inked obligation remained unchanged. If he could not meet it, debt or punishment followed. If he exceeded it, he could keep the remainder, but the state did not adjust obligations lightly. In this way, paper bound millions more tightly than chains ever could. Yet ledgers also brought a strange stability. The knowledge that obligations were fixed gave farmers a dull predictability. So long as the fields produced, the family could endure. And endurance, rather than prosperity, was the quiet rhythm of life in Ming China. The bureaucrat's perspective. What of the tax collector himself? To imagine his world is to imagine monotony. His desk was cluttered with brushes, inkstones, seals. His robes marked him as a minor official, respected enough to command deference but never celebrated. Each day brought the same motions: verify, record, stamp, repeat. And yet within this monotony lay his survival. To deviate, to stir suspicion of corruption or favoritism, meant ruin. To follow the forms precisely meant safety. Still, corruption existed. Some officials skimmed grain, others demanded bribes. A clever clerk might alter ledgers subtly, shifting burdens from one household to another. Such manipulations were not always noticed, but when discovered, they could lead to harsh consequences. For most, however, survival meant keeping one's head down, obeying the forms, and disappearing into the background of history. An endless cycle. As you sit with this image, the endless cycle becomes clear. Farmers planted and harvested. Clerks recorded and collected. Granaries filled and emptied. Soldiers marched, fed by grain they would never know the origins of. And the emperor in Beijing, seated beneath the dragon throne, never saw the weary faces of those who made his empire possible. His decrees traveled downward through layers of bureaucracy. The rice traveled upward, one sack at a time. This quiet rhythm endured for centuries. It was dull, oppressive, and yet profoundly effective. The Ming Dynasty would last nearly 300 years, its foundation secured not by dramatic battles, but by the ceaseless work of men in offices like this one. A system too big to see. As the 15th century progressed, the Ming taxation system, so carefully constructed with rice, ink, and obligations, began to stretch under its own weight. Like a granary beam bearing too many sacks, it groaned quietly before the first cracks became visible. You could still sit in a county office and see the same routine: names read aloud, records consulted, fields measured, sacks tallied. But beneath this stability, a storm was brewing. The Ming Empire, at its height, governed over 150 million people, more than any contemporary European power by orders of magnitude. It ruled vast territories from the forests of Yunnan to the floodplains of the Yangtze. Its bureaucracy, massive by necessity, began to suffer from a familiar disease of scale: distance from the center, dilution of oversight, and human error layered over human intention. The silver shift, disrupting the rice economy. The largest shock to the tax system was not a rebellion or invasion, it was silver. Beginning in the mid-15th century and accelerating in the 16th, the Ming government began transitioning from a tax-in-kind system, collecting rice, grain, and cloth, to a silver-based system. This began with the single whip reform, Yitiao Bayan Fa, which consolidated various taxes and labor duties into one single monetary payment, calculated in silver taels. This change sounds simple enough. Instead of sending grain to the granary, a farmer now paid in silver. Theoretically, this freed up the administrative system. It was easier to store silver than sacks of millet. It reduced losses from rot, theft, or spoilage. On paper, this was efficiency, but on the ground the consequences were enormous. Farmers, who had lived for centuries in a largely subsistence-based economy, now needed access to silver currency. But silver was not mined in China at scale, it came from abroad, often through trade with the Spanish, who brought silver from the Americas via Manila. This meant that the Ming peasantry was now at the mercy of global trade networks they neither understood nor could influence. The tax clerk's life changed too. No longer tallying bushels, he now weighed ingots and coins, verified purity, recorded silver values. Corruption found new avenues: manipulating weights, debasing coins, inflating tax rates to account for fluctuating silver prices. And what of the poor farmer, whose rice might be plentiful but whose silver was short? He now had to sell his crop, often at a disadvantageous price in local markets, just to meet his tax obligation. A good harvest no longer guaranteed survival. It had to translate into silver first. Bureaucratic drag, lost in paperwork. The Ming bureaucracy's strength was in its rigid procedures, but that was also its greatest weakness. As complaints rose about tax burdens, unfair assessments, or corrupt officials, they had to move up the chain. From local clerk to county magistrate, from prefecture to provincial level, and then perhaps to the capital itself. Each stage added delay, confusion, and the risk of losing the matter in a sea of scrolls. Appeals could take years. Farmers died waiting. Some matters simply vanished when a new official took office and discarded old reports. If a village claimed it was wrongly taxed, the clerical process required comparison to original field surveys. But what if those had been poorly conducted years ago? Or if, more commonly, a local official had accepted a bribe to revise the yield figures upward? Your average county clerk likely wasn't malicious. He was simply overwhelmed. He had hundreds of villages under his jurisdiction, limited staff, limited time, and even more limited motivation. Better to stick to procedure. Better not to challenge the system that, while flawed, kept him paid, safe, and overlooked. The dangers of local power. The imperial court in Beijing wanted control, but control over vast distances was limited by the speed of travel and communication. The empire relied heavily on local elites, landowners, village headmen, literate men with ties to both local communities and the bureaucracy to implement policy. These gentry acted as intermediaries, but they also protected their own. A well-connected headman might underreport the size of his village's harvest, shielding it from heavier taxes. Or he might shift burdens onto rival families. He might even collaborate with the local tax official to divert grain or silver for personal use. The result was uneven taxation. Some counties met their quotas, others fell short. Some granaries were full, others mysteriously empty. And while the emperor issued edicts demanding justice, fairness, and honesty, the reality on the ground often diverged sharply. From the perspective of a common tax clerk, the incentive to challenge a powerful local figure was almost non-existent. Doing so might mean retaliation, loss of position, or even being accused of misconduct yourself. Better to look away. Rebellion from boredom. The Ming state feared rebellion, but it often failed to understand the forms rebellion could take. While grand revolts like those of Li Zicheng, who would later overthrow the dynasty, captured attention, most unrest was quieter. Peasants abandoning villages, fields left fallow, ledgers marked with names that no longer existed. These were the rebellions of neglect, despair, or silent refusal. As silver became scarcer, taxes increased. As inflation rose, officials demanded more to meet quotas. When people could no longer pay, they fled. A village might see half its families disappear over a decade, but to the tax records they still existed. The remaining villagers bore the burden. The clerk, stuck with impossible math, did what many do when faced with bureaucracy in crisis. He fabricated. He wrote down what ought to be true, not what was. He adjusted harvest estimates to meet quotas. He invented missing families. He passed the ledger upward where it passed unread through layers of administration. This quiet falsification became a form of survival, and eventually it became normal. The grain that never came. Perhaps the most illustrative breakdown of the Ming tax system came in moments of crisis. Famines, especially in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, struck provinces like Shanxi and Henan. Grain was supposed to be stored in granaries, collected over years, ready for disaster. But when officials opened the stores, they were empty. The records showed they were full, but the reality was loss, corruption, and neglect. The local tax clerks had reported full stores. They had stamped the ledgers, sealed them, and sent them upward. Everyone above them had relied on that data. No one had checked. No one had wanted to, because if the grain was gone, someone was at fault. Better to believe the paperwork. In these moments, the gap between the ink and the earth was fatal. People died because the numbers lied. But the system wasn't designed for truth, it was designed for procedure. Case study: the Wanli Emperor's absentee rule. To fully grasp the administrative fatigue of the late Ming period, Consider the Wanli Emperor R 1572-1620, who, after early promise, largely withdrew from active governance for the final 2 decades of his reign. He stopped attending court meetings, refused to sign edicts, and left the civil service adrift. In his absence, eunuchs and bureaucrats squabbled over control. Tax records continued to be submitted. Quotas were technically met, but no one was really checking. The machine continued to hum, but it hummed on inertia, not energy. Your county tax collector in this era might still wear his official robes, still stamp scrolls, still hold audiences. But in his eyes, the fire had gone out. The emperor no longer watched. The center no longer held. The work was still done, but only because it had to be. And so he dipped his brush again. Name, harvest, obligation. Move to the next line. Outside, the village crumbled. Inside, the record remained pristine. Ending question for Section 2. If the clerks, the farmers, and the granaries all continued their roles, but only in form, what finally brought this quietly crumbling system to collapse? What was the cost of a government that appeared to function, but no longer truly did? The illusion of continuity. You sit again in the dusty corner of a Ming County office, brushes neatly aligned, tax ledgers stacked, the same ritual unfolding as always. A farmer bows, a name is recited, grain or silver is presented. A red seal marks the transaction. Everything appears as it should. And yet, beneath the rituals, the empire is breaking apart. This was the tragedy of the late Ming. The surface of governance remained intact even as the foundations turned to dust. Bureaucracy, as a habit, persisted long after it had lost the capacity to govern effectively. The tax collectors wrote, stamped, filed, and recorded, but the things they recorded were no longer real. Names of families long gone, harvests that never grew, granaries already emptied. The collapse came not from drama, but from disconnection between the map and the territory, the ledgers and the land. Silent revolt, peasants flee the page. In the early 17th century, the toll on the countryside became too great to bear. Natural disasters, floods, droughts, locusts struck with increasing frequency, made worse by the little ice age that chilled much of Eurasia. Harvests failed, but taxes remained. You could not tell the tax office that your fields had withered. The ledgers did not wilt with the rice. The system demanded silver regardless. And so peasants vanished. They abandoned villages at night, slipped into banditry or refugee camps, or sold themselves into debt servitude. In official documents, their names remained. Taxes were still levied against them. The burden fell on those who remained, sparking a slow but inevitable unraveling of local order. To the clerk, the problem became impossible. Each year, fewer farmers arrived to pay. Each year, the quotas from above stayed the same or increased. Eventually, many gave up. They stopped correcting the records, stopped reporting accurately, and simply wrote what was expected. The Great Ledger became fiction. Administrative paralysis. The Ming central government, still operating from Beijing, was paralyzed by court infighting and a fractured civil service. The Grand Secretariat, nominally responsible for coordinating administration, could not manage the scale of dysfunction. Reports flowed upward, but they were often contradictory or fabricated. Edicts flowed downward, but they were routinely ignored or misunderstood. Bureaucrats who attempted real reform were often punished. A zealous official might uncover tax fraud or corruption and report it honestly, only to find himself reassigned, demoted, or even executed for causing unrest. Over time, ambition waned. Survival required obedience, not initiative. The bureaucracy preferred balance over truth. Even the famed imperial censors, tasked with rooting out corruption, were overwhelmed. There were simply too many false ledgers, too many missing peasants, too many stolen stores. Some censors turned corrupt themselves. Others filed honest reports that went unread. The administrative machine that once coordinated a massive empire was now inert, incapable of either self-correction or adaptation. And still the clerks wrote. The rise of Li Zicheng. In 1630's Shanxi province, a former postal worker named Li Zicheng began to attract followers among the desperate, starving peasants. He promised tax relief, redistribution of land, and an end to corrupt officials. He did not seem especially threatening at first. The Ming had faced rebellions before. But this rebellion was different. It was not just peasants, it was clerks, minor officials, and disenfranchised gentry. It was fueled not by ideology, but by exhaustion. The empire had failed to feed them, failed to protect them, and worst of all, failed to recognize that they had been suffering for decades. When Li's forces overran towns, they often found little resistance. In many cases, the tax offices were already abandoned. The bureaucrats had fled. The grain stores were empty. The rebellion spread not because of strength, but because the empire had already withered in place. In 1644, Li's forces marched on Beijing. The last Ming emperor, Changzhen, hanged himself on a hill outside the Forbidden City. The bureaucracy, so deeply invested in its procedures, could not act quickly enough to stop what had been unraveling for years. And so the dynasty fell. The sound of empty granaries. What was it like then in the final months before collapse in a rural county office? The ink still flowed. The names were still read aloud. The stamps still thudded into red wax, but the farmers were gone. The silver did not arrive. And still the clerk, perhaps the son of a clerk, the grandson of a clerk, continued the rituals, not because they mattered, but because they were all he knew. You can imagine him sitting there, brush in hand, recording a name he knows no longer belongs to any living man. He does not know that the capital has fallen. He has not heard that a new dynasty, the Qing, will soon rise. His world is small, contained within the margins of his ledgers. To him, the empire still exists, so long as he continues to write it into being. Aftermath: the Qing and the cleanup. The Qing dynasty, founded by the Manchus, inherited not just territory but administrative decay. They were foreigners, steppe warriors by origin, but they quickly understood the power of paperwork. Instead of dismantling the Ming bureaucracy, they adopted it, reformed it, and eventually restored it. In some counties, Qing officials discovered tax rolls still in use, unchanged for decades. They updated them, purged the dead names, and started again. The Qing reintroduced grain taxes but tempered them with regional flexibility. They established new census-taking procedures and attempted to root out floating populations, those who had no registered home. They invested in better granary management, and in some cases, they forgave back taxes entirely to restore peasant trust. But the ghost of the Ming bureaucracy lingered. The Qing, like their predecessors, came to rely on forms, ledgers, and local elites. They too would eventually face the challenge of a system that recorded more fiction than fact, but for a time, they brought stability. The old Ming tax collectors, those who survived, either retired, were absorbed into the Qing service, or faded into obscurity. Their offices were repainted, the seals were recarved, but the rhythm remained: measure, record, seal, repeat. The legacy of ledgers. What did it all mean? An entire dynasty rose and fell on the backs of clerks whose work was mind-numbingly dull. They did not write laws, win battles, or invent machines. They copied lists, weighed grain, wrote receipts. And yet, they held the empire together longer than any general could have. The Ming tax bureaucracy offers a quiet lesson. Systems of governance do not collapse when the palace burns. They collapse when records stop being real, when obligations no longer reflect capability, when ritual replaces reality. It teaches us that boredom is not neutral. The slow erosion of trust, the creep of paperwork over substance, these are not footnotes to history. They are history. When modern governments debate tax codes or census methodology, they repeat these same ancient struggles. How do you measure people fairly? How do you prevent falsification? How do you ensure that the system doesn't outgrow the society it governs? In the end, the Ming Dynasty's downfall was not sudden. It was not spectacular. It was administrative. It was a silence where there should have been grain, a name on a list that no longer lived, a brush that continued to write long after there was nothing left to say. Final reflection. You began this journey in a quiet room, watching a clerk tally sacks of rice with calm, practiced gestures. And now, centuries later, that same calm has faded into decay. But the motions linger like muscle memory. The ink has dried, but the paper remains. As you drift further into rest, ask yourself, in our own age of forms, files, and silent systems, how many empires still run on ledgers that no longer reflect the world they claim to govern? Story 2. The Counting Houses of Venice. Double-entry bookkeeping and the sleepy birth of Welcome to Venice, the other Venice. Close your eyes and think of Venice. You might picture gondolas gliding down narrow canals, elaborate masks during carnival, or Byzantine cathedrals gilded in gold leaf. But what if I told you the real machinery that drove Venice's golden age sat not on the water but at a desk? Imagine instead a dimly lit counting house tucked behind a merchant's courtyard in the mid-15th century. You hear no laughter or music, only the soft scratching of quills against parchment, the occasional clink of coin on ledger. A man in a plain robe with ink-stained fingers lifts his head, sighs, and returns to a page half filled with numbers. He is a bookkeeper. He does not sail. He does not fight. He does not rule. And yet he is at the center of the Venetian world. Welcome to the other Venice. The Venice of ledgers, of columns and balances, of meticulous records and patient math. This is the story of how boredom, slow, methodical boredom, quietly gave birth to modern capitalism. The need to count, a city built on trade. By the late Middle Ages, Venice had transformed itself from a collection of lagoon settlements into one of the wealthiest trading powers in Europe. Its strategic position in the Adriatic allowed it to dominate trade routes between Europe and the East. Spices from India, silk from China, glass from Murano, and wool from Flanders all flowed through its ports. This commerce required structure. Ships were financed by partnerships. Goods were consigned and reconsigned. Profits and risks were shared among multiple parties, often across month-long voyages. It was no longer sufficient to simply store coins in chests or scribble totals in the margins of a parchment. You needed a system, a method not just to record profit and loss, but to understand them. That's where double-entry bookkeeping came in. But before we get to debits and credits, we must understand the people who made such a system necessary. The merchant accountants of Venice. The Venetian counting house. A counting house in Renaissance Venice was both a workplace and a vault. It might be attached to a merchant's palace, with stone walls for fire protection and iron locks on every cabinet. Shelves lined with account books called library master books, held records going back decades. These books were tied shut with leather cords, inked with iron gall, and written in a flowing cursive that combined Latin, Venetian dialect, and technical shorthand. The accountant's desk was wide, designed to hold open a large ledger. Beside it sat an abacus board or later wooden numeral counters. Contrary to modern assumptions, Arabic numerals had not yet fully replaced older systems in daily business. Math was done largely by hand and often checked twice. Accountants were often relatives of merchants or hired professionals trained in arithmetic schools. Their job was to ensure that every sale, every shipment, and every investment was properly recorded, and that no discrepancies could be blamed on negligence. Their handwriting was expected to be legible, their math impeccable, and their loyalty unquestioned. A revolution in ink, the birth of double-entry bookkeeping. It's easy to take double-entry bookkeeping for granted today. Every financial transaction is mirrored. If one account gains, another loses. This system balancing debits and credits was not always the norm. Earlier accounting practices were simple tallies, listing goods in and goods out, with little attention to overall balance. The innovation, likely borrowed and refined from practices in medieval Islamic and Byzantine worlds, was first codified in Italy. Venetian merchants didn't invent double-entry bookkeeping, but they perfected it. And the most famous codifier of this system was a Venetian-trained monk, Luca Pacioli. In 1494, Pacioli published Summa d'Arithmetica, Geometria, Proportioni et Proportionalita, a textbook covering all aspects of mathematics known at the time. Buried within was a section titled Particularis de Computis et Scripturis, details of calculation and recording, which became the first printed description of the double-entry method. But in truth, Venetian accountants had been using this system for decades before Pacioli. They referred to it as alla veneziana, the Venetian way. What was double entry, really? In a quiet room, a clerk opens a ledger. On the left side of the page, he writes, "Debit 100 ducats, purchase of pepper." On the right side, "Credit 100 ducats, reduction from cash on hand." This is the heart of the system. Every transaction affects two accounts, and the books must always balance. The left and the right, the debit and credit, the inflow and the outflow, everything in equilibrium. This was more than accounting, it was philosophy. It suggested a world in which everything had consequence. Gain was not free, loss did not vanish. Every movement echoed elsewhere. For a merchant republic like Venice, this was a revelation. But it was also, let's admit it, tedious. Maintaining this balance required slow, repetitive work. Every shipment received required adjusting inventory, updating partner shares, recalculating future liability. Mistakes weren't just inconvenient, they could cause legal disputes, lost fortunes, or accusations of fraud. Yet for all its dullness, the system had immense power. The slow birth of financial accountability. Before widespread double-entry accounting, many merchants relied on memory or vague records. Trust was personal, but memory fades and partners die and lawsuits happen. The new system gave permanence, and with permanence came accountability. Venetian accountants were required to retain ledgers for years. Some were even submitted to notaries of commerce, city-appointed officials who could verify claims in court. The book became a legal document. The accountant became, in a sense, a witness to reality. In many cases, the act of recording protected not just merchants but workers. Sailors and dockhands could appeal for unpaid wages by referring to entries in company books. Disputes between partners were resolved by ledger entries, not memory. The neutrality of numbers became a form of justice so long as those numbers were recorded honestly. Of course, not everyone recorded honestly. Creative accounting existed even then, but the system itself discouraged deception by its very design. You could not simply add income without subtracting it elsewhere. The lie had to balance too. The rise of the merchant accountant. This new respect for accuracy elevated the social status of accountants. No longer mere assistants, they became trusted advisors. Some rose to manage entire trading firms. Others became tutors, training young merchants in arithmetic, proportion, and the delicate art of not being defrauded. Venice's Scuole Grandi charitable confraternities sometimes funded schools in practical arithmetic. The curriculum focused on currency conversion, measurement systems, and of course, double-entry bookkeeping. Young men hopping to enter the merchant class were often tested on their ability to balance a ledger, convert florins to ducats, or calculate interest on delayed payments. In a society without computers or calculators, the accountant became the brain of the business. Their role was not glamorous. It required no violence, no art, no oratory, but it was indispensable. And so they wrote, day after day, week after week, pepper, wool, indigo, silk, credit, debit, margin, cost. A city on paper. By the end of the 15th century, Venice had become a city built not just on water but on paper. Trade routes reached as far as the Levant, the Iberian Peninsula, and even the North Sea. Each shipment generated records. Each agreement required copies. Notaries, clerks, and accountants formed a silent bureaucracy beneath the bustling markets. You might walk through the Rialto market and see chaos, shouting vendors, sweating porters, reeking crates of fish or resin. But behind this noise, in quiet counting rooms above the stalls, a parallel world thrived. In that world, trade was abstracted. A ship was not a mast and sail, it was a number on a line in a ledger. A merchant's risk, his profit, his very reputation, existed not in how loudly he haggled, but how cleanly his books were kept. Even the government got involved. Venice's tax authorities relied on merchant records to assess duties. Fraudulent books meant fines or even imprisonment. At the same time, accurate books could win favorable rulings, loan approvals, or state contracts. Venetian capitalism, such as it was, depended on these dull, disciplined practices. Ending question for Section 1. But what happened when markets shifted, empires collided, and old bookkeeping systems strained to keep up with new global complexities? Could the quiet brilliance of de Balentry survive the chaos of early capitalism? From quills to contracts, expansion brings complexity. The Venetian merchant of the 15th century lived in a world of visible goods and tangible exchanges. A bale of wool here, a chest of pepper there. He saw what he sold. He touched what he bought. But as Venice expanded, so too did the abstractions of commerce. In time, merchants no longer just tracked physical inventories. They tracked shares in ships they did not own, profits from goods they never saw, investments in ventures they could not supervise. The ledger, once a quiet record of physical trade, began to take on a new role: predictor, risk evaluator, trust certifier. And with these new expectations came cracks in the system. The de Balentry method, brilliant in its logic, was still built for an earlier kind of world. It balanced what had happened. It was less equipped for what might happen. But as the 16th century unfolded and global trade routes exploded, Venetian accountants found themselves increasingly managing the unknown. The rise of venture capital in the 1500s. Before the modern venture capital world of Silicon Valley, there were the merchants of Venice and their ships. A wealthy investor might fund a portion of a voyage to Alexandria or Constantinople. These investments were often pooled, 5 or 10 individuals contributing silver to outfit one ship, hopping for profits from spices or textiles. These arrangements were called commenda contracts, a legal form of joint venture in which one party provided capital and the other managed the expedition. In these deals, risk was shared, so were profits, and so were the headaches. Bookkeepers had to track not just the balance of the business, but the balance of expectations. Who owned how much? Who received what cut? What if the ship sank? What if the price of saffron collapsed before the cargo arrived? What if a partner died en route? Each of these possibilities had to be accounted for somehow, and so the role of the Venetian accountant expanded again. Now they weren't just recording facts, they were preparing for hypotheticals, and as always happens when risk meets money, ambiguity crept in. When numbers lie. Let's imagine a scenario. A merchant house has 3 backers. A voyage returns with a modest profit, but silver has devalued slightly due to an influx of Spanish coinage. One partner disputes the amount due to him. Another partner claims additional losses from an earlier trade. The accountant, trying to keep peace, massages the numbers, rounds a few figures, delays an entry, writes a footnote that only he understands. In the short term, the books balance. The partners shake hands. Business continues. But the fiction has begun. And once begun, it is hard to stop. By the mid-1500s, Venice was awash in creative accounting. Some firms kept 2 sets of ledgers, one for internal use, one for auditors. Others developed complex notations designed to obscure rather than clarify. Some used dummy transactions entries that technically balanced the books but concealed cash flows between family members. Accountants, once paragons of quiet accuracy, now lived in a gray zone between loyalty and legality. Enter the auditor. As accounting became more complex, the Venetian Republic responded in the only way bureaucracies know how. It introduced more oversight. Auditors called revisori were appointed by the state or by merchant guilds to inspect books, verify balances, and resolve disputes. These men were themselves former accountants, experienced in the silent arts of ink and margin. Their arrival in a counting house was rarely welcomed. Audits were time-consuming, and even honest firms feared having small errors interpreted as fraud. But the revisori had power. They could nullify contracts, fine firms, or report violations to the Council of Ten, Venice's elite governing body. In response, accounting practices evolved again. Bookkeepers became more careful with terminology. Margins were left wider, ink colors used more consistently, shorthand clarified. Accounting manuals were published in Venice, offering guidance not just on how to record, but how to appear honest. One such manual, Del modo di tenere il libro doppio domestico, written in the late 16th century, includes entire sections on defensive bookkeeping, anticipating auditor questions, preparing supporting evidence, and creating a narrative of integrity through the structure of the books. Trust was no longer just earned, it was designed. Venice and the global ledger. As Venetian merchants pushed into more far-flung markets, India, North Africa, even the New World, they began to operate in legal and cultural environments far from their own. This raised challenges for bookkeeping. How do you record a profit from a colony in Brazil when the goods arrive 3 months late, in foreign currency, valued in a volatile market? How do you account for trade in slaves morally fraught, legally murky, and inconsistently taxed? Venetian books began to include conversion tables, margin notes with fluctuating exchange rates, and cross-border notations. Some even included political annotations, warnings that certain routes might be taxed differently depending on wars or shifting alliances. At this point, the ledger had become more than a list of debits and credits. It was a map of risk, reputation, and relational capital. And for the weary accountant, it meant longer hours, more calculations, more signatures, more careful wording, more versions of the truth. The human cost of clean books. With the growing pressure for perfect balance came human fallout. Apprentice accountants, often teenagers, were put through grueling routines. They copied ledgers by hand for hours, performed calculations on unreliable abacuses, and were punished for numerical errors, even honest ones. Some firms required apprentices to swear oaths over open ledgers, promising loyalty and accuracy. Mistakes, when discovered, could be career-ending. In a 1592 court record, an accountant was tried for falsifying shipping records. His crime: misstating the date a ship left port, which impacted the calculation of late penalties. He was found guilty not because he profited, but because the error undermined investor trust. He was fined, barred from guild service, and his books were publicly burned in the Rialto Square. Other accountants simply burned out. Venetian diaries from the period include entries describing fatigue, headaches, and confusion of numerals. One merchant's son wrote of his father: he began to see errors where none were. He feared the auditors would find lies in every page. He rewrote the books thrice in 1 week. Even in a city of grandeur, the weight of invisible numbers could be unbearable. From Venice to the world. Despite its growing flaws, the Venetian system had an enormous impact. Merchants from the Netherlands, Germany, and England studied Venetian books. Apprentices traveled to Venice to learn the double method. Copies of Pacioli's works were translated and reprinted across Europe. In Amsterdam, the Dutch East India Company would adopt modified de Balentry books. In London, Firms along the Thames developed hybrid systems using both Venetian and local practices. Even colonial outposts used Venetian-style ledgers to track sugar, tobacco, and silver. Ironically, as Venice's political and maritime power waned in the 17th century, its accounting legacy spread. The Republic's merchant bureaucrats had created a system that outlived their own relevance. By the time Venice fell to Napoleon in 1797, its books were still open, but its ports were no longer the center of the world. The quiet work of centuries had moved on. The ethics of accuracy. Throughout this era, a philosophical question lingered in the background of every ledger. Is accuracy a moral good, or merely a performance? Venetian accountants wrestled with this question not in essays, but in decisions where to record a cost, when to delay a debit, how to frame a loan repayment. These choices were not always about money. They were about loyalty, power, and fear. And yet, despite everything fraud, stress, ambiguity, the discipline endured. Why? Because without it, nothing else worked. A trade empire without reliable records is just a gamble. A partnership without shared books is just a handshake. And an economy without accountability is just noise. Venice proved that even the dullest work, when done carefully, can build worlds. Ending question for Section 2. But as the age of empires and industrial capital loomed, could this sleepy system rooted in parchment and patience survive the acceleration of finance, speculation, and credit? Or would the world outgrow the slow balance of debits and credits? The ledger in decline. As the 17th century turned into the 18th, the ledgers of Venice grew quieter, not from completion, but from obsolescence. Ships still arrived in the lagoon, merchants still wrote in ink, and accountants still kept two columns, but the world around them had changed. New powers had risen. Amsterdam now controlled the lion's share of northern trade. London, with its banking innovations and expanding colonial empire, was overtaking the Mediterranean giants. Even Lisbon and Antwerp had, at various points, eclipsed Venice's reach. Venetian trade, once bold, far-reaching, and tightly organized, began to shrink. Wars with the Ottoman Empire, competition from Atlantic ports, and internal stagnation slowly strangled the Republic's relevance. But curiously, the accounting never stopped. In the backrooms of shrinking merchant houses, bookkeepers still wrote. They still balanced. They still recorded trade routes that were now shorter, narrower, more local. They tracked cloth sold within the city, wine distributed along the Po River, or debts owed by noble families. The grandeur was gone, but the system remained. It was as if the city no longer ruled the seas, but still ruled the page. The slow rise of credit. In this quieter era, another shift took place, one that reshaped capitalism forever. Credit. Early Venetian commerce was based largely on physical exchange. Silver, goods, and services passed hand to hand. But as trade slowed and liquidity dried up, merchants leaned more heavily on promissory notes, deferred payments, and interest-bearing instruments. Venetian accounting adapted. Ledgers began to track not what existed, but what was promised. A grain shipment might not yet be in the port, but it was already in the books, valued, allocated, even taxed. A noble might not have paid his debt yet, but the interest was accruing, line by line. Accountants now spent more time recording obligations than outcomes. In a sense, they began to write the future into their books. This was a subtle but profound change. The balance sheet had always been a mirror of what had occurred. Now it became a map of what should occur. And with that shift, the accountant was no longer just a recorder of the past, but a quiet architect of financial expectations. The Venetian bankers and the early skeleton of finance. By the early 1700s, banking had begun to take on modern form. Venetian institutions like the Banco della Piazza di Rialto and the Banco Giro had long acted as deposit and clearing houses. but they now evolved into proto-central banks managing state debt, issuing credit, and stabilizing exchange rates. These banks relied heavily on debenture accounting, both for internal operations and for public confidence. A failure to balance the books was not merely an administrative error, it was a political crisis. In fact, in 1638, a banking panic was narrowly averted when auditors discovered discrepancies in loan records at Banco Giro. The solution? A marathon of cross-checking by a council of revisori, who spent 3 days and nights in candle-lit counting halls, verifying every entry going back 5 years. Their conclusion: no fraud, only misrecording. Still, the incident sparked calls for greater standardization, and so Venice began to formalize its accounting training. Clerks were now required to pass public examinations. Approved textbooks were circulated. Bookkeepers who served large firms needed to be registered with guilds. Venice, even in decline, insisted on order. A tidy empire of decline. By the late 18th century, Venice was no longer the Venice of Marco Polo. Its influence was regional, its navy minimal, and its merchants largely concerned with internal Italian trade. But the administrative backbone, those silent rows of numbers, remained intact. In fact, in many ways, the ledgers grew more organized as the empire shrank. Why? Because smaller systems are easier to control. Audits were faster, partnerships fewer, ships less ambitious. The bureaucracy, once overstretched, could now comfortably contain its modest economic sphere. This was the final form of the Venetian ledger, a neat, self-contained world, perfectly balanced if no longer significant. The accountant in this era knew he was maintaining order in a system that was, in truth, irrelevant to global power. But the point was no longer global influence. It was internal continuity, predictability, the comfort of numbers that added up. And so the books remained open. Napoleon and the final entry. In 1797, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded northern Italy. Venice, old and diplomatically isolated, surrendered without a fight. After over 1,000 years as an independent republic, the city-state ceased to exist. And yet, when French troops entered the city, they found the offices still operating. Clerks still tallied taxes. Port records were still updated. The state's ledgers were still current. A French officer reportedly remarked, "The war is over, but the accountants have not noticed." In the weeks that followed, French administrators seized Venice's financial records, thousands of ledgers, scrolls, and account books. Most were boxed and sent to Paris. Some were destroyed. Others were examined and quietly admired. One general wrote in a letter, "Their books are more organized than ours. Every transaction is signed, dated, and balanced. They live in ink." The fall of Venice was swift, but its accounting impeccable. The legacy of the ledger. Venice did not invent debenture accounting, but it gave it permanence. From the quiet counting houses of the Republic came the disciplines that undergird modern finance. Standardized ledgers, recorded liabilities, transparent partnerships, legal accountability through books, auditing as governance. Even the very idea of a corporation, a legal entity with a separate financial identity, was anticipated by the way Venetian firms were structured and recorded. In London and Amsterdam, later financial centers, these practices were absorbed, modified, and expanded. But the quiet discipline, the clerks working long hours in lamplight, balancing ledgers to the last ducat, remained the unseen influence. When the Dutch East India Company issued shares to the public, they balanced them. When British banks tracked debts across continents, they relied on systems pioneered in the Mediterranean. And when you open a spreadsheet today, tracking income and expense, you are participating in the same tradition. A thoughtful routine. In our age of digital ledgers, high-speed trades, and complex derivatives, It's easy to forget the origins of financial discipline, but the roots lie in ink and patience, in dusty rooms filled with books, in the hands of men who thought carefully before recording a single line. Their work was boring. They did not change the world overnight. They balanced it quietly. And if you think about it, that's a far rarer gift. The accountant's final role. There's something poetic about the fact that the greatest legacy of Venice, the Serene Republic, was not its navy, its conquests, or its cathedrals. It was its quiet numbers. Numbers that lived in ledgers, margins, columns, and calculations. Numbers that told the truth. Or tried to. In a world full of power plays and political lies, the Venetian accountant offered something else. A dependable line, a careful record, a truth not proclaimed but written. He was not a hero, he was not a villain. He was a mirror. Final reflection. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, remember the ledger, not because it's dramatic but because it endures. Empires fall, ships sink, markets collapse. But the record remains. And if it was written with care, balanced, clean, and honest, it speaks louder than any trumpet ever could. Now ask yourself, in a world addicted to noise, could the future be quietly written again in lines of balance, patience, and ink? Story 3. Salt and Silence. The French gabelle and centuries of quiet resentment. The most hated tax you've never heard of. You likely don't think about salt very often. It's on your kitchen table, sprinkled over potatoes or boiled into pasta water without a second thought. But for the people of pre-revolutionary France, salt was no mere seasoning, it was a legal obligation, a heavy burden, and a source of national resentment for centuries. This is the story of the gabelle, the French salt tax. A tax so minor in appearance, so boring in detail, and so quietly pervasive that it helped push a kingdom to revolution. It wasn't loud, it wasn't glamorous, but it was everywhere. A nation divided by salt. Let us travel back to 17th century France. The country is a patchwork of provinces, cultures, and customs, but also, unusually, a patchwork of salt zones. Depending on where you lived, you paid a different rate on salt, or none at all. Some regions were designated pays de grande gabelle, where the tax was heaviest. In these areas, the government controlled the salt trade completely. Every person over the age of 6 was legally required to buy a fixed amount of salt each year, whether they needed it or not. This was called the sel obligatoire, obligatory salt. Other areas like Brittany or parts of Provence were exempt or lightly taxed. This wasn't due to geography or need, but politics. Some regions had struck favorable tax deals with the crown generations earlier. The result? One nation, multiple salt economies. A peasant in Burgundy might spend 2 weeks' wages on tax salt. His cousin in Anjou might buy the same amount for half the cost or less. The salt wasn't different, but the rules were. Why salt? Salt wasn't just for flavor. Before refrigeration, salt was preservation. It kept meat from spoiling, preserved fish caught in coastal towns, and played a crucial role in cheese, butter, and bread production. It was essential to daily life, which made it a perfect target for taxation. Kings have always taxed necessities: bread, alcohol, land. But salt was especially attractive because it was universal. Everyone needed it, and it was easy to regulate. It had to pass through specific roads, warehouses, and ports. Controlling the flow meant controlling the revenue. The French monarchy, especially under kings like Louis XIII and Louis XIV, expanded the gabelle system as part of a broader effort to centralize control and raise funds without relying on the unpredictable generosity of nobles. And so salt became not just a condiment but a government monopoly. The role of the fermiers gagnants. At the heart of this system was a class of men who embodied the quiet machinery of French fiscal policy, the fermiers gagnants, or tax farmers. These were not peasants with hoes or landlords with titles. They were administrators, wealthy individuals or syndicates who leased the right to collect taxes from the crown. In exchange, they guaranteed a fixed amount of revenue to the monarchy and kept anything collected above that for themselves. Think of it like buying a license to harvest resentment. The Gay Bell was one of their most prized domains. They oversaw salt warehouses called greniers à sel, where the population was required to make their purchases. These granaries were heavily guarded and meticulously managed. Every sack, every scoop, every grain was counted, recorded, and priced. An official might spend hours each day verifying shipments, balancing ledgers, and calculating obligations down to the ounce. It was not glamorous work, but it was profitable. A day in the life of a salt clerk. Picture a quiet salt granary in a town like Tours or Bourges. The clerk arrives early. He unlocks the main door, retrieves the iron-bound ledger from its chest, and prepares his scale. The morning's shipments are recorded. The salt, brought in from coastal depots or salt pans, is weighed, stacked, and sealed. Villagers arrive in line, each household forced to buy their mandatory quota, known as the sel de devoir. It doesn't matter if they're poor, vegetarian, or simply stocked up from the previous year. The law is the law. The clerk writes names, records weight, collects payment, stamps receipts. The work is dull, routine, quiet. But it is power. Behind the desk, the clerk holds the authority of the crown. He determines compliance. He may forgive a shortfall or report it. He may overlook a late payment or enforce a fine. To those outside, he is not just a man at a desk. He is the embodiment of the Gay Bell. And in some towns, he is the most hated man in the marketplace. Salt smuggling, the quiet rebellion. With inequality baked into the Gay Bell system, and salt prices often tripled by taxation, a shadow economy emerged. Salt smuggling. Known as the faux-sauniers, false salt sellers, these men and women ferried untaxed salt across provincial borders, sometimes in barrels, sometimes sewn into clothing, or hidden inside loaves of bread. Salt smuggling was so widespread that it spawned a parallel administrative system. A special salt police force, known as the Gabless, patrolled roads and rivers. They stopped carriages, searched bags, interrogated travelers. Punishments were severe. Fines, imprisonment, corporal punishment, and sometimes the galleys, where convicts rode ships for years at a time. But despite the risks, smuggling persisted. Why? Because it was logical. To the peasant, it made no sense to buy overpriced salt from the state when a neighbor had the same product for less, untaxed, pure, and abundant. The law was irrational, and irrational laws breed quiet rebellion. Clerks knew this, so did the fermiers gagnants, but the system was profitable, and so it persisted. Paper before people. As the Gay Bell system matured, it became more about paperwork than people. Every salt granary produced volumes of reports, daily sales logs, monthly summaries, enforcement records, police notices, fines, smuggling reports. Each town's records were shipped to regional offices, then transcribed again in Paris, where bureaucrats reviewed them in candle-lit halls, searching for anomalies. Did this granary sell too little last month? Why did this village buy less salt than the year before? Were the quotas met? In this world of forms and filings, the lives of real people became data points. The clerk did not think of the widow struggling to pay for her salt. He thought of the number she was supposed to meet, the field on the page, the row in the table. In this way, the Gay Bell was both a tax and a philosophy. That order mattered more than equity. That compliance mattered more than need. And that silence meant success. Ending question for Section 1. But what happens when too many people stop following the quiet rules? When the records no longer match the reality, and the salt stops flowing not because of war, but because of will? 1,000 quiet crimes. By the middle of the 18th century, The French countryside was filled with criminals. But these were not thieves in alleyways or rebels with muskets. No, they were millers, widows, shepherds, and schoolteachers. Their crime: salt. In a nation legally required to buy state-issued salt at inflated prices, millions quietly circumvented the rules. They bought from neighbors. They bartered with smugglers. They scraped salt from coastal pans and carried it inland in boots, in sacks, in secret. To the administrators in Paris, this was lawlessness. To the people, it was survival. And the clerks, the men in the granaries with their ledgers and their red wax seals. They became enforcers of a law almost no one respected. The paperwork remained pristine, but the reality beneath it had slipped. The scale of the problem. Salt smuggling was not a nuisance, it was an economy. In some provinces, as much as 2/3 of all salt consumed came from illegal sources. Entire regions developed supply chains independent of the state. A fauconnier might begin as a simple farmer. Perhaps he owned a mule. One day, he accepts a delivery a few sacks of salt from Brittany, where the tax was low. He transports them across the Loire River to Anjou or Touraine, where the gabelle was highest. He sells them quietly to villagers, often for a price well below the legal rate, but still with a tidy profit. He repeats the trip. He adds companions, routes, scouts, bribes a gabelou or two. Soon, he is the head of a smuggling network, rivaling the state's own supply. Salt clerks in high gabelle zones noticed the discrepancy. Official sales dropped. Reports from rural villages showed declining compliance. Yet the ledgers were still submitted, stamped, reviewed. Some clerks inflated numbers to mask the decline. Others submitted falsified reports. A few wrote quietly to Paris, "The salt does not sell." Paris responded with laws, not reforms, not adjustments, just laws. More inspection, more patrols, more punishments. The assumption was simple: the people must be reminded who controls the salt. The gabelous, France's most unloved policemen. To enforce the gabelle, the state employed thousands of gabelous salt tax police. These officers had special powers. They could stop anyone, search homes and carriages without warrants, and detain suspected smugglers without immediate trial. Armed with muskets, wearing distinctive uniforms, the gabelous were as feared as they were despised. They patrolled roads, set up checkpoints, and followed tips from informants. Some took their job seriously. Others demanded bribes to look the other way. Imagine a peasant woman walking a country road with a loaf of bread tucked under her arm. A gabelou stops her. He breaks open the bread. Inside, salt. She is arrested. Her name is added to a growing list recorded carefully by the local salt office clerk, alongside the weight of contraband, the method of concealment, and the imposed fine. The ledger grows longer each week. Some villages began holding secret trials for informants. Gabelists were ambushed, beaten, sometimes killed. The war over salt became one of silence and shadows. And the salt clerks, though rarely attacked, felt the rising tension. They kept their heads down. They filed their forms. They never asked why the salt bins stayed full. The records lie. By the 1760s, the gap between the books and the reality had become too wide to ignore. In the Pays de Grande Gabelle, salt warehouses reported steady stock, but sales plummeted. Villages officially listed as compliant had not sent buyers in months. The obligatory quotas were technically fulfilled, but only because some clerks recorded phantom purchases to meet expectations. Some accounts show officials using straw names recording salt sales under fake or deceased individuals, just to avoid audit flags. Meanwhile, Parisian bureaucrats noted inexplicable discrepancies between projected revenue and actual coin receipts. Salt was being distributed, but not through official channels. An entire class of bureaucrats, the intendants, who oversaw provincial administration, began quietly recommending changes to the gabelle. Lower the tax, unify the rates, ease the quotas. But the crown needed money, and so the system remained. Reformers and realists. Not everyone in power was blind to the crisis. A small group of Enlightenment-era thinkers began to question the logic of the gay bell, not just economically, but morally. The philosopher Voltaire famously wrote, "The gay bell is that curious invention by which one man pays for the right to consume, and another is paid to pretend he enforces it." Economists like Anne Robert Jacques Turgot, who would later serve as finance minister, argued that the tax created more instability than revenue. He proposed abolishing it altogether, replacing it with a uniform, modest levy across all regions. He was met with fierce resistance from the Fermiers Gaynerocs, from court advisors, and from the king's own inner circle. The salt tax, they claimed, was too embedded to change. Too much revenue depended on it. Too many bureaucrats managed it. Too many clerks filled too many ledgers for too many years. To unravel the gay bell would mean unpicking an entire administrative culture. And so nothing changed. The people turned. In the countryside, resentment fermented into quiet fury. The injustice of the gay bell was not theoretical, it was personal. A farmer is jailed for underbuying his salt quota during a bad harvest. A widow is fined for receiving smuggled salt as a gift. A village priest is warned not to host smugglers, even as half his congregation does. People who had never broken a law now lived in quiet rebellion, day after day. They didn't protest in the streets. They didn't write pamphlets. They bought salt, illegally. And in doing so, they declared without shouting that the law had lost legitimacy. The ledgers go quiet. In the final decades before the French Revolution, something strange began to happen in the salt offices. The paperwork continued, the stamps were inked, the pages turned. But the ledgers, once rich with detail, margins filled with notes, signatures, annotations, enforcement logs, grew sparse. Some clerks stopped documenting smuggling altogether. Others merely listed the day's visitors, regardless of what was or wasn't purchased. A few offices recycled old pages, copying entries from previous years. The appearance of order remained. But the system, like the salt itself, had decayed. The true records were no longer written. And in this silence, the collapse began. The gay bell meets revolution. When the French Revolution began in 1789, many factors were at play: hunger, debt, monarchy, class. But the gay bell stood out as a symbol of everything wrong with the ancient regime: its injustice, its inefficiency, its obsession with paperwork over people. In July of that year, as peasants rose up across France, salt warehouses were among the first buildings ransacked. Granaries were looted, ledgers burned, tax officials chased out of towns. In one instance in Berry, the entire salt office staff was locked inside their granary as townspeople carted away barrels of salt without payment, without violence, without apology. The revolution had come not with gunfire but with a collective shrug. In August 1790, the National Constituent Assembly officially abolished the gay bell. Centuries of records, thousands of ledgers, rules, and receipts became worthless overnight. The clerks, once so central to the king's revenue system, found themselves unemployed. Their quiet authority evaporated in a single vote, ending question for Section 2. But in a country now free of the gay bell, how would the state fund itself? Could a new order rise without the weight of the old paperwork, or would another system of quiet taxation simply take its place? A new nation, salt-free. When the gay bell was finally abolished in 1790, it was not with a bang, but with a clause in a document quietly inserted, voted upon, and signed. The National Constituent Assembly, determined to dismantle the machinery of the ancient regime, had spent months reviewing grievances from across France. The Cahiers de Doléances, notebooks of complaints submitted by every town and village, mentioned many injustices, but the salt tax appeared again and again, page after page, like the low hum of collective irritation. So they removed it. The ledgers stopped. The granaries were shuttered. The mandatory salt quotas dissolved. For the first time in generations, a French peasant could use salt freely, without ledger, without receipt, without fear. It was a simple liberation, but a deeply felt one. In Brittany, families threw parties, openly displaying salt sacks at their dinner tables. In the Loire Valley, smugglers retired, their underground networks now obsolete. Salt, the substance that once defined rebellion, had become ordinary again. And yet France still needed revenue. The vacuum left by the Gabelle. Abolishing the Gabelle created a new problem: financial collapse. The French state, already deep in debt from its involvement in the American Revolution and years of aristocratic tax exemption, relied on indirect taxes like the Gabelle for nearly 10% of its annual income. The system was inefficient and hated, but it worked. Now, without it, the Treasury faced a yawning hole. The solution: a new system, or rather systems. In the revolutionary period between 1790 and 1799, France cycled through multiple tax experiments. Some were grand, like land-based assessments tied to productivity. Others were oddly specific, such as taxes on windows, doors, or chimneys. But all shared a common trait: they required measurement, documentation, enforcement. In other words, bureaucracy. And while the Gabelle was gone, the spirit of its administration returned. The revolutionary ledger. It's easy to imagine that revolution swept away the old ways entirely, but that's rarely how bureaucracies die. They morph, they adjust, they repurpose. The revolutionary tax clerks, many of them former Gabelle officials, quickly found themselves back at desks, now tasked with tracking new obligations. Where once they measured salt quotas, they now measured land plots. Where once they recorded salt fines, they now logged property declarations and proof of citizenship. Ledgers returned, stamps returned, receipts returned. The only difference: the header no longer bore the royal fleur-de-lis, but the words République Française. Napoleon and the return of control. The French Revolution brought chaos, fiscal, social, and administrative. When Napoleon Bonaparte seized power in 1799, he promised order. He delivered it in part through a complete overhaul of the French tax system. In 1806, under Napoleon's Ministry of Finance, the Direction Générale des Contributions Indirectes was created. Its purpose: to replace inefficient, hated taxes like the Gabelle with a new system of consumption taxes, including those on alcohol, tobacco, and yes, eventually, salt. That's right. In 1806, the Gabelle was reintroduced. Not in name, of course, and not with the same arbitrary regional structure, but salt once again became a tax commodity. The logic was the same: everyone uses salt, everyone can be taxed. And once again, the machinery of regulation returned. Granaries reopened. Permits were required. Ledgers reappeared. A new class of clerks was trained to measure, record, and enforce. They worked quietly, methodically, echoing the routines of their royal predecessors, but now in service to empire, not monarchy. Salt, once a symbol of liberation, had quietly become revenue again. Why did the people accept it? It's tempting to ask, why didn't the people rise up again? The answer lies in presentation. The new salt tax was national, applied uniformly, with a fixed rate. There were no longer privileged provinces or unfair quotas. Smuggling declined because there was no longer an incentive imbalance between regions. The injustice had been removed, even if the cost remained. More importantly, Napoleon offered something in return: stability. Roads were repaired, laws were codified, Markets were secured. The bureaucracy under his watch became more efficient, less corrupt, more predictable. And predictability, for many French citizens, was worth more than freedom from tax. Bureaucracy as legacy. In the century that followed, France's taxation systems continued to evolve. Indirect taxes became a staple of government funding applied to goods, services, luxuries, and necessities alike. But the ghost of the gabelle lingered. Every French schoolchild who studied the Revolution heard of it. Writers used it as shorthand for bureaucratic absurdity. Philosophers referenced it in debates over justice and the role of the state. The word gabelle even survived in French legal vocabulary, used colloquially to refer to any minor, annoying tax. And in the dusty corners of France's tax offices, the structure remained. Clerks, ledgers, receipts, ratios, forms. The Revolution had swept away a king, but not the need to record, measure, and extract. The modern clerk. In a strange twist of history, today's direction générale des finances publiques France's modern financial administration can trace its administrative roots, at least in part, back to the salt clerks of the ancient regime. Modern French civil servants, trained in institutions like the École Nationale d'Administration, ENA, still work with tools of measurement and compliance, now digitized but conceptually familiar. They no longer measure salt in sacks. They manage tax codes, VAT, social contributions, carbon levies. But the quiet rhythm of the clerk remains. Review the form. Confirm the figure. Issue the receipt. File the report. The tools have changed, the rituals have not. Was the gabelle all bad? It would be easy to condemn the gabelle as pure injustice, and in many ways it was, arbitrary, regressive, and cruel in its enforcement. But it also offers a lesson. Governments are made of systems, not speeches. The gabelle didn't endure for centuries because it was loved. It endured because it worked bureaucratically. It had officers, granaries, ledgers, enforcement. The infrastructure of taxation is often more powerful than ideology. When new regimes arise, they inherit not just land and laws but files. And those files, those records of who owes, what are the true skeleton of the state. Salt in the bloodstream. Salt is no longer taxed in France today. Not directly, but its story continues in every customs office, in every VAT report, in every quiet morning where a government clerk opens a digital portal and begins the day's work. Somewhere in a Parisian ministry, a civil servant balances figures for agricultural subsidies. Another prepares a report on transportation fuel tax compliance. Another responds to a citizen's complaint about social contribution brackets. None of it is dramatic, none of it is cinematic, but all of it is essential. In that sense, the salt clerk lives on. Final reflection. We began this story with a pinch of salt and ended with the foundation of modern governance. Not through revolution, not through rebellion, but through the steady, quiet persistence of record-keeping. So tonight, as you drift off, imagine a desk, a scale, a ledger, a clerk adjusting his glasses, dipping a pen into ink and carefully recording a number. He does not know he's writing history, but he is, one grain at a time. Now ask yourself, is freedom truly found in the absence of control, or in the quiet reform of the systems that sustain it? Story 4, Stamps and Seals, the Austro-Hungarian Empire's endless paperwork. A world organized by rubber stamps. Picture an office not in Vienna or Budapest, but in a provincial town, somewhere on the edge of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the late 19th century. Perhaps in Galicia or Transylvania or Bohemia. The windows are tall but smudged. The light is weak. The wallpaper is faded. There are stacks of folders in every corner, some tied with string, others bursting from their seams. A kettle sits cold on a filing cabinet. And a man, quiet balding, spectacles slipping down his nose, hunches over a piece of paper, holding a stamp in his hand. He is not writing a new law, nor governing a territory. He is certifying that a traveling tinker has properly paid his municipal licensing fee for open-air sales of tinware in a market square 2 weeks from now. He applies the stamp, wipes the excess ink with a blotter, and files the form under T. Tomorrow, he will do the same thing again. This was the engine of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, not its armies or emperors, but its bureaucracy. A sprawling paper world that catalogued every subject, controlled every transaction, and defined reality with stamps, signatures, and seals. And it was impossibly boring, but also remarkably effective. A dual monarchy, a dozen languages, and one filing system. Founded in 1867 after the Ausgleich Compromise between Austria and Hungary, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was one of the most complex political entities ever constructed. It stretched from the Alps to the Balkans, home to over 50 million people, speaking at least 15 major languages and countless dialects. How do you govern such a place? With paperwork. And more importantly, with paperwork that looks the same everywhere. The empire quickly adopted uniform bureaucratic formats, identical forms, identical stamps, identical ledger designs, regardless of whether you were in Graz or Lviv. Official documents were printed in dual columns, German and Hungarian, with blank spaces for local variants, such as Czech, Croatian, or Polish. The result was an elegant illusion. One empire, one system, even if no one spoke the same language. If the forms matched, the empire held. The paper economy. To understand the machinery of the Habsburg bureaucracy, we must understand its tools. Forms. There were forms for births, deaths, marriages, land sales, grain deliveries, livestock health, academic achievement, window taxes, firewood permits, road maintenance obligations, and passport issuance. Stamps. Each office had its own set of rubber or metal stamps. Some were plain, others ornate, bearing imperial crests or provincial seals. They certified that a document was not only complete but valid. Seals. For more official matters, court decisions, royal edicts, or property transfers, wax seals were used. These were pressed with engraved metal dies, usually kept locked in drawers and only handled by senior clerks. Receipts. Every transaction generated a receipt, and every receipt had a duplicate. Some had triplicates, some had counterfoils. Receipts were often stamped again, dated, numbered, and signed in blue-black ink. Files and ledgers. Most offices used a dual system, files for correspondence and ledgers for formal registrations. Each entry in a ledger referenced a file. Each file might reference multiple ledgers. Entire careers were spent just maintaining these cross-references. This world of ink and paper required legions of civil servants, known in Austria as Beamte class of men, and later, a few women trained in record-keeping, form processing, and procedural interpretation. Their motto, Ordnung muss sein, there must be order. Becoming a clerk. To become a state clerk in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you didn't need ambition, you needed accuracy. The civil service examination tested arithmetic, penmanship, legal terminology, and perhaps most importantly, the ability to interpret ambiguous instructions without error. Successful candidates were assigned to administrative posts, district offices, police bureaus, tax assessment centers, passport divisions, postal registries, and more. Most started in junior roles, copying documents or managing appointment logs. Promotions were based on tenure and faultlessness, not brilliance, not boldness. A good clerk was one whose work never needed correction. And so, from Galicia to Carniola, the empire was staffed by men whose lives followed a quiet rhythm. Arrive, open the register, stamp, sign, copy, file, and repeat. It was not exciting, but it functioned. The power of the stamp. In the Austro-Hungarian world, nothing existed legally speaking until it was stamped. A birth without a stamped certificate was not recognized. A marriage without a stamped license was invalid. A business without a stamped registration could be fined or closed. A document without the right color of stamp, red for judicial, blue for fiscal, green for agricultural, might be returned or destroyed. This reliance on stamped documentation created a strange kind of authority, one that rested not in the emperor or even the law but in procedure. Clerks often cited form numbers and subparagraphs as justification for denying requests. Your application is incomplete under Section 12B of Form ZL-18. Appeals could take months. Many gave up. But most complied, because the real fear was being outside the paperwork unrecognized, unapproved, unstamped. It meant not existing. Kafka's Vienna. No story of Austro-Hungarian bureaucracy would be complete without mention of Franz Kafka, born in 1883 in Prague, a city then within the empire. By day, Kafka worked at the Workers' Accident Insurance Institute, drafting safety reports and processing injury claims. By night, he wrote fiction, much of it inspired by the quiet madness of administrative life. In The Trial, The Castle, and other works, Kafka portrays characters lost in paperwork, trapped in systems they cannot understand, facing decisions rendered by nameless clerks quoting unknown rules. These were not fantastical exaggerations. They were reflections. Kafka once remarked that the most terrifying thing in his office was not cruelty, but indifference. An error on a form might delay a widow's compensation for months, not because anyone meant harm, simply because the machine had rules. And rules were not broken. When the system froze, despite its scope and precision, the Austro-Hungarian bureaucracy faced constant pressure from nationalist movements, linguistic disputes, and rural illiteracy. In regions like Bosnia or Bukovina, many citizens could not read the dual-language forms. Local officials sometimes filled out documents for them, introducing errors, favoritism, or subtle manipulation. In Hungary, clerks resisted using Slovak or Romanian in official correspondence, even when the law permitted it. In Bohemia, Czechs pushed for more autonomy over local documentation, often clashing with Vienna's insistence on uniformity. And yet through all of this, the paperwork persisted. As one official in the imperial ministry wrote in 1899, "It is not our laws that unite this empire, it is our filing cabinets." A machine with no off switch. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Austro-Hungarian bureaucracy had become a self-sustaining ecosystem. It didn't just manage the empire, it was the empire. Every day across nearly 700,000 square kilometers, thousands of clerks, administrators, assessors, typists, archivists, and messengers moved paper through halls, upstairs, down corridors, into mail bags, out of train stations, and across borders. A new birth in Zagreb, Form Z1A. A mill dispute in Bohemia, Form KR88. A timber transport license in Carniola, Form L13 triplicate with forest surveyor's signature. From the outside it was order, from the inside it was volume. But there was a problem. The world was getting faster. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was not. The delayed telegram. In 1908, a newly appointed district administrator in Dalmatia attempted to implement updated sanitation codes in accordance with a Ministry of Health directive. He submitted a requisition for new inspection forms. 3 weeks later, he received a reply from the wrong ministry. He resubmitted. 6 weeks later, the correct forms arrived printed in Hungarian, not Italian, Dalmatia's administrative language. He filed a complaint. The reply came in German. He didn't speak German. The forms were finally replaced 3 months later. In the meantime, the regulations changed. This was not unusual. In many rural offices, the bureaucratic apparatus moved so slowly that instructions became obsolete by the time they arrived. And yet, the system didn't collapse. It just kept going. People adjusted. Delays became expectations. Obsolescence became routine. Bureaucracy no longer responded to reality. It recorded it months behind. The inertia of obedience. The real brilliance and danger of the Austro-Hungarian bureaucracy was that it taught obedience not to men or laws, but to forms. If the form said no, the answer was no even if logic or compassion suggested otherwise. A widow whose husband died building a state railway line might be denied benefits because the ink on his employment certificate had faded, and the registry office would not accept a photocopy. A teacher transferring districts might be forced to restart their pension contributions because their previous district had used an outdated payroll code. A prisoner might remain in custody for months after sentencing because the release order required a signature from an official who had retired. These were not failures, they were design features. The system prized procedural integrity over human interpretation. And in doing so, it created a culture where correctness was defined by paperwork, not truth. Drowning in good records. The empire's central ministries in Vienna and Budapest were repositories of staggering paper volume. Each had record archives that stretched for kilometers. Filing systems were indexed by color, string type, and punch hole placement. A trained archivist could retrieve a 5-year-old report in under 5 minutes, assuming the classification code was correct. But if a report was misfiled, it might be lost forever. Entire committees were sometimes formed just to find one misplaced document. In 1906, the Ministry of Agriculture spent 6 months locating the original tender for a bridge construction in Bukovina because the duplicate had been destroyed in a fire, and the contractor was suing for unpaid invoices. The file was eventually found misfiled under flood prevention. This case was so infamous, it became known as the bridge without a paper among civil servants. The tragedy wasn't that mistakes happened. The tragedy was that mistakes had no mechanism for correction. The machine could process indefinitely, but could not adapt. The bureaucracy as identity. Oddly enough, many subjects of the empire began to define themselves through documents. To be Austro-Hungarian didn't mean speaking German or Hungarian or pledging loyalty to the emperor. It meant having a passport, a land deed, a tax identification number, a military service card, a birth certificate with a seal. Citizenship was not an idea, it was a file. This identity through paperwork gave the empire a strange cohesion. A Ruthenian farmer in Galicia and a Jewish shopkeeper in Trieste might share no language, no religion, no politics, but both could point to a stamped document and say, "I belong." And yet this identity was also fragile. If a document was destroyed, denied, or questioned, your place in the empire could vanish overnight. When nationalism met procedure. As ethnic tensions grew in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the bureaucracy became a battleground. Hungarian officials resisted translating forms into Slovak. Croatian regions demanded autonomy over local school records. Romanian communities lobbied for census recognition under specific ethnic terms. These were not just symbolic fights. They were about representation in the files and, by extension, in the future. The central government often responded with administrative compromise. Trilingual forms, dual-entry ledgers, separate data collection protocols. The result, more complexity. A land deed in Transylvania might be written in Hungarian, Romanian, and German, certified by 3 offices, each using different boundary descriptions. The paper trail grew longer, but the unity frayed. Sarajevo, bureaucracy meets tragedy. In 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated in Sarajevo, triggering the First World War. But in the weeks before his visit, local officials had issued warnings. Police officers noted heightened tensions. One report, submitted by a low-ranking civil servant, listed suspicious activity among student groups. It was filed correctly, stamped, indexed. But it never reached the right desk in Vienna. It wasn't ignored, it wasn't denied. It was simply lost in the system. This is the dark side of a machine too large to see itself. War and paper. World War I shattered the empire. But even as borders crumbled and armies marched, the bureaucracy persisted. In 1916, a soldier on the Italian front wrote home requesting a marriage license extension, required under Austro-Hungarian law if the wedding did not take place within 6 months of the permit being issued. His request was routed to the Ministry of the Interior. He died at the front 2 weeks later. His extension was approved. Such stories weren't rare. The system moved on regardless of context. War didn't stop the stamps, but it made them absurd and eventually irrelevant. Ending question for Section 2. What happens when the paper world becomes too big to carry, too rigid to bend, and too slow to catch up? Can a nation survive when its ledgers outlive its logic? The empire collapses, the files do not. The Austro-Hungarian Empire officially ceased to exist on November 12, 1918. After 4 years of war, revolution at home, and military defeat abroad, the dual monarchy dissolved into a dozen new states. The Emperor Karl I abdicated without fanfare. Flags changed. Borders were redrawn. Armies disbanded. But inside office buildings from Vienna to Sarajevo, something strange happened. The clerks kept working. The stamps were still inked. The forms were still filed. The registers still opened at 8:00 a.m. sharp. Why? Because no one told the bureaucracy to stop. And more importantly, no one had a replacement. A world inherited by paper. As new countries sprang from the wreckage, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Austria, Poland, each one faced an immediate administrative challenge. How do you govern a nation today when you have no infrastructure of your own? The answer was practical: keep using the old system. And so former imperial offices were absorbed whole. The clerks stayed in their chairs. The seals were modified. The letterheads were replaced or sometimes scratched out and restamped. The procedures, forms, and ledgers left unchanged. In many cities, the only indication that a new nation existed was a slightly different rubber stamp. The survival of forms. For decades after the collapse, Habsburg administrative documents continued to shape daily life across Central and Eastern Europe. A Czechoslovak marriage certificate in 1922 might still refer to imperial form numbers. A property dispute in northern Romania could be resolved using land surveys conducted by Habsburg foresters in 1903. A Yugoslavian customs form from 1930 might be an exact replica of its Austro-Hungarian predecessor, with only the language and emblem replaced. In the chaos of war, these remnants offered stability. The system may have been slow and confusing, but it existed and people trusted it, if only because they had no other option. Ironically, this made the Austro-Hungarian bureaucracy one of the most enduring ghost institutions in modern history. The phantom clerks. What happened to the civil servants? Most simply stayed. A Hungarian postal clerk became a Czechoslovak one. A Croatian court archivist became a Yugoslav official. A German-speaking tax assessor in Bohemia now worked for Prague. Many didn't even change offices. In memoirs from the 1920s, Former beat recalled shuffling through their workday with an eerie sense of non-event. The emperor was gone, but no one had told them to stop processing livestock declarations or marriage bans. Some adapted, some resisted, but most simply followed the paper. Because that's what they had always done. Bureaucratic aftershocks. The long paper trail left by the Habsburgs created unintended consequences. Contradictions. In the interwar years, it wasn't uncommon for property deeds to be disputed across languages and regimes. A Czech landowner might possess a deed issued in Latin, recorded in German, contested in Hungarian, and adjudicated in Slovak. Overlapping jurisdictions. Some rural offices found themselves claimed by multiple new states. A village in Carpathian Ruthenia received tax notices from both Hungary and Czechoslovakia, each citing a different version of the imperial code. Legal fossils. Courts occasionally upheld decisions based on imperial ordinances because no one had formally repealed them. In one Polish town, a fine was issued in 1935 based on an Austro-Hungarian noise ordinance from 1876. These were not isolated incidents, they were systemic echoes. And no one knew how far back the paperwork went. The long paper trail. The Austrian state archives still hold tens of millions of documents from the imperial era. Civil registrations, census records, land books, tax rolls, military enlistments, an entire paper memory of a vanished world. Historians today marvel at the detail. A farm sale in Moravia in 1881, listing crop yield projections. A train station hearing ledger from 1909, showing age, literacy, and dialect. A widow's pension claim from 1916, referencing her husband's participation in a roadwork project 14 years prior. Each document is stamped, signed, sealed, meticulously preserved, not because anyone expected the empire to fall, but because the form was the rule. And the rule, once written, was sacred. The legacy of quiet governance. Modern Europe owes more to the Austro-Hungarian bureaucracy than it likes to admit. The cadastral systems, detailed land ownership maps, used across Central Europe today, developed under Habsburg rule. The civil registration methods for births, marriages, and deaths in Hungary, Austria, and the Czech Republic, direct descendants of imperial protocols. Even the tradition of statistical obsession, counting things, recording them, categorizing them, has roots in the empire's ceaseless quest for procedural order. While the empire vanished, the habits of administration lived on. And habits, like stamps, leave impressions. The human side of monotony. Not all stories are dry. In some cases, clerks left behind marginalia notes scribbled in pencil in the margins of files. Applicant appears confused but honest. Filed late again, likely due to rain. Too many copies, check with supervisor. One clerk, reviewing a 1914 military exemption request, simply wrote, "War is here, recommend approval." These were quiet acknowledgments that behind every form was a person. The clerk, trained to follow process, could still see the human shape beneath the lines. And in their own way, they resisted not with protest but with precision. They made the machine humane, one carefully stamped entry at a time. The clerk's end. What became of the last true imperial clerks? Most retired in the 1920s and 30s. Some watched as fascist regimes replaced paperwork with ideology. Others lived through a Second World War that tore up borders once again. In their final years, they were often seen as relics, vestiges of a boring, slow, and overly formal past. But when asked about their time in service, many said the same thing. We kept things together. And they did. Not with armies, not with flags, but with files. Final reflection. We often think of history as the story of grand battles, noble speeches, or soaring revolutions. But perhaps history also lives in smaller moments. A stamp pressed into parchment, a ledger line neatly drawn, a clerk's careful note in a forgotten archive. The Austro-Hungarian Empire may have fallen, but its paperwork remains quiet, organized, and still whispering order into a chaotic world. So tonight, as you rest, picture that desk once more. The ink, the forms, the seal. And remember, sometime the softest hands hold the strongest empires. Now ask yourself, if all that's left of a nation is its paperwork, did it truly disappear? Or did it simply file itself away? Story 5. The Post-Riders of Imperial Rome, Bureaucracy on Horseback. A message in motion. Close your eyes and imagine a dusty Roman road in the late 2nd century CE. The air is dry, the sun hangs heavy over distant hills, and a lone horseman is galloping at a measured pace. He wears no armor. His saddle is plain. Strapped to his side are leather pouches sealed, stamped, and tied with twine. Inside those pouches, not gold, not weapons, not maps. Letters. Not letters of love or poetry or scandal, but instructions, orders, notifications, reports. They are marked imperial business, destined for governors, tax assessors, military officials, and archives. He is a post-rider of the Cursus Publicus, Rome's official state courier system. He is not a soldier, but he may be more important. He carries not the sword of empire, but its memory. And like everything in the Roman world, he is doing something deeply boring, and yet profoundly essential: inventing administrative speed. In an age before email, before telegrams, even before modern handwriting, Rome faced a colossal logistical challenge. How do you administer an empire stretching from northern Britain to the sands of Arabia? You don't use pigeons. You don't use town criers. You build a bureaucracy on horseback. The cursus publicus, often translated as the public way or public course, was not just a road system. It was a full logistical network designed for the movement of documents. Built by emperors, maintained by local authorities, and used by the state, it connected thousands of miles of territory through messengers, relay stations, and a chain of responsibility. At its height under emperors like Hadrian and Septimius Severus, it could move a letter from the Danube frontier to Rome in less than 10 days. How? Through relentless organization. A system of stations and seals. The cursus publicus was divided into two primary components: mansions, way stations spaced roughly every 25-30 kilometers, where messengers could rest, eat, and replace horses. Mutations, smaller stations or change points with fresh animals, but few or no lodgings. Each post rider carried a diploma, a kind of official pass issued by the imperial office or the emperor himself. This diploma allowed them to requisition horses, food, and lodging from the state. Without it, even a Roman senator had no right to use the service. Each letter bore a seal, often with a lead tag stamped with an imperial mark. The recipient would examine the seal before opening. A broken or tampered seal was taken seriously and could result in inquiry, arrest, or worse. It was, in many ways, ancient chain of custody protocol. Who were the post riders? The couriers were called cursors or stationarii, a mix of state slaves, freedmen, and low-ranking officials. Most were not well paid, but the job came with privileges: state lodging, protection under imperial law, and a certain pride in being the veins through which the empire's brain communicated. They rode at regulated speeds. Contrary to modern imaginings, these weren't reckless gallops through the countryside. Speed was important, but consistency was better. Horses were rotated to prevent exhaustion. Riders logged their departures and arrivals in ledgers maintained at each station. It was not romantic. It was not heroic. It was procedure. Paperwork in motion. What did these couriers actually carry? military orders from the emperor to distant legions, tax records sent from provinces to the treasury in Rome, census data collected on wax tablets bound in leather, senatorial decrees needing acknowledgement in the provinces, rescripts legal decisions by the emperor answering petitions from governors or civilians, inventory lists for grain, oil, and weapons, construction approvals for roads, aqueducts, or forts, personnel files for appointments, retirements, or commendations, and occasionally, very occasionally, personal letters from aristocrats, but only with proper clearance. A cursus writer did not choose what to carry. The packet was sealed, the route was assigned. He delivered, signed the log, and returned. The Roman paperwork problem. Managing the cursus publicus was no small task. The empire produced an enormous volume of documentation, so much so that many Roman emperors, including Augustus and Hadrian, implemented strict controls to prevent abuse of the system. Only government business was permitted. Any private use required special permission. Every courier had to sign in and out at stations. Horses used for unauthorized travel were to be confiscated. Governors who exceeded their courier quotas could be fined. The imperial chancellery in Rome maintained centralized logs of usage, sometimes sending inspectors to audit local stations. The bureaucracy had bureaucracy. The weight of a letter. One might imagine a letter in the Roman world as a scroll of papyrus or parchment. Often that was the case, but many official communications were written on wax tablets, which were reusable, portable, and easily sealed. A report from Gaul might arrive in Rome as a bundle of 6 wooden tablets, bound in leather and tied with twine. A clerk would examine the seal, unbind the package, and copy the contents into a ledger by hand. Then the document would be filed into a wooden archive box, marked by clay tag or carved inscription, stored in a room with hundreds of others, indexed by name, subject, date, and origin. Some were stored for months, others for years, a few indefinitely. The Romans had no concept of just-in-time communication. They believed in just in case. Better to have the paper than not. A costly convenience. The cursus publicus was funded through state levies, which often fell on local towns. Communities near major roads were obligated to provide horses, carts, and food for passing couriers, sometimes without compensation. This led to resentment. A town in Cappadocia might see 20 state riders in a single week, all demanding fresh mounts. In response, some towns created false logs, claiming horses were unavailable due to plague or flood. The imperial government responded by increasing surveillance. In some cases, entire towns were fined for failing to meet courier obligations. Bureaucracy breeds bureaucracy, and complaints generate forms. From the boring comes the brilliant. Despite its blandness, the cursus publicus was one of the great administrative achievements of antiquity. It allowed Rome to govern a continent-sized domain without modern communications. It fostered standardized formats, courier authorizations, route logs, seal verification, and data archiving. It enabled emperors to respond to rebellions, plagues, tax shortages, and natural disasters with relatively current information, sometimes within weeks. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. And perhaps most tellingly, when it failed, the empire suffered. A warning from Pliny. In one of his letters, Pliny the Younger, then a provincial governor, wrote to Emperor Trajan about the challenge of forwarding 2 contradictory documents sent by 2 magistrates, both claiming to be the rightful tax assessors of a small town. He was unsure which one was genuine. So he sent both by official courier, along with a letter explaining his confusion and asking the emperor for clarification. It took 5 weeks to receive a reply. By then, the town had already chosen a third assessor on their own. The process failed not because of malice, but because the system had no mechanism for ambiguity. It ran on seals, not on sense. Ending question for Section 1. What happens when a courier system built for obedience meets a world full of exceptions? Can an empire that relies on sealed certainty survive the rise of uncertainty? The burden of empire. By the 3rd century CE, the Roman Empire was showing signs of administrative fatigue. The cursus publicus, once the sleek arterial system of imperial control, was becoming overburdened, underfunded, and increasingly vulnerable to misuse. It was still moving riders, still carried orders from emperor to governor, but the speed had slowed. The roads were less maintained. Relay stations were short on horses, and many of the messages no longer arrived on time, if at all. In a world where time was measured in weeks and accuracy in wax, delay was dangerous. But the bureaucracy didn't stop. It simply carried on slower. A paperweight empire. The bureaucracy didn't shrink with the empire's troubles. It grew. More rebellions, more reports to file. More tax resistance, more forms to complete. More inflation, more ledgers to track coin debasement. More provinces splitting, more governors sending contradictory orders. By the mid-3rd century, the average imperial edict passed through at least 4 levels of copying and authentication before reaching its recipient. Some regions like Syria and Britannia had developed their own mirror systems, essentially duplicating the cursus publicus to handle local demands. This made paperwork redundant, but not more effective. Corruption on the course. As the system slowed, abuse crept in. Some officials began forging diplomas, the courier passes, that granted access to the state-run roads. Black market copies were sold to wealthy merchants and aristocrats eager to move goods and messages faster. Riders, once strictly regulated, started carrying private letters, or worse, contraband under the guise of official business. In response, emperors such as Diocletian and Aurelian issued crackdowns. Seals were made more complex, with unique imperial marks. Diplomas were registered at central offices and tracked by serial numbers. Severe penalties were introduced, including property confiscation for towns that enabled fraudulent couriers. But like any aging system, tightening the rules only highlighted the weaknesses. Diocletian's grand reform. In 284 CE, Emperor Diocletian came to power and attempted to restore imperial control through a sweeping administrative overhaul. He reorganized provinces, increased the number of governors, and implemented a rigid bureaucratic hierarchy. And at the heart of this was a revitalized cursus publicus, now divided into 2 branches. Cursus velox, the fast courier service with fresh horses at every station. Cursus clabularis, the slower transport system using ox carts for goods and heavier documents. Each was assigned specific stations, riders, and maintenance schedules. Governors were expected to submit monthly reports on station function, horse health, and road conditions. It was brilliant in theory. In practice, it strained the empire's finances even further. Taxation and transport. Maintaining the courier system became expensive, and those costs were passed down. Towns were taxed in goods and services, not just coin. This included requisitioning local horses and oxen, feeding state couriers, housing inspectors, repairing stations and bridges. For struggling communities, especially in Gaul and North Africa, this created immense burdens. Some began to falsify records claiming stations were unusable, roads blocked, or diseases rampant. Others abandoned their obligations altogether. Ironically, the system created to ensure imperial reach had begun alienating the very towns it depended on. Too many messages. Another issue arose: volume. Under Diocletian and his successors, the bureaucracy generated so many documents that it flooded its own network. The sheer number of orders, replies, confirmations, and reports overwhelmed even the best-maintained routes. Reports were delayed. Orders contradicted each other. Governors responded to old directives already replaced by newer ones. Archives struggled to keep pace with copying, indexing, and storing. Worse still, messages sometimes arrived after the events they addressed had passed. A tax relief order could reach a province weeks after collectors had seized grain. And because the Roman world placed supreme value on official instruction, governors would often wait for guidance even when local action was urgently needed. In effect, the machinery of government had become a bottleneck. The rise of intermediaries. To cope, local officials began appointing intermediaries, trusted subordinates or agents who could interpret imperial orders and act in advance of clarification. But this broke with tradition. The cursus publicus was designed to transmit, not translate. By allowing interpretation, the empire risked inconsistency across provinces, competing authorities in crisis, breakdown of command clarity. This was not merely a logistical issue, it was a cultural one. Rome prized order, hierarchy, and discipline. The introduction of unofficial interpretation undermined that identity. The human cost. Post-writers, once proud participants in the empire's communication web, were now often overworked, underfed, and threatened by local unrest. Horses were stolen by bandits. Stations were burned during revolts. Riders were attacked for carrying imperial tax notices. In the 290s, reports reached the imperial court that stationarii were refusing assignments in certain provinces altogether. The empire responded not with reforms, but with fines and threats. More rules, more documents, more strain. When roads become ruins. As the Western Roman Empire declined in the 4th and 5th centuries, the roads, once marvels of engineering, began to deteriorate. Stations fell into disrepair. Couriers skipped check-ins. Governors relied on local messengers or military riders, bypassing the cursus publicus entirely. In some provinces, it simply ceased to function. But in others, like the Eastern Roman, Byzantine Empire, it evolved. Byzantine administrators retooled the courier system with new protocols, fewer stations, and centralized dispatch centers. They embraced flexibility where the Romans had insisted on formality. It wasn't faster, but it was lighter. And that allowed the Byzantine state to last another 1,000 years. The end of the line. By the late 5th century, the Western cursus publicus was effectively dead. The last state writers disappeared not with a bang, but with a filing error, their records never updated, their stations never repaired, their existence quietly forgotten. Yet even centuries later, medieval rulers across Europe marveled at Rome's system. Charlemagne attempted to recreate it. The Holy Roman Empire emulated its postal seals. Venetian and Habsburg networks used similar relay principles. The idea of government-issued courier passes persisted into the 18th century. Rome's roads may have crumbled, but the idea of bureaucratic communication by relay endured. Ending question for Section 2. If a system designed to bring clarity becomes the cause of confusion, at what point does the paperwork outweigh the message? Can bureaucracy survive when its roads no longer lead where they're supposed to? The road lingers. The last official post riders of the Western Roman Empire likely vanished sometime in the late 5th century, but their legacy refused to be buried. Long after emperors fell and legions disbanded, the idea of a centralized courier system built not for trade or conversation, but for orders, filings, and reports remained a silent aspiration for the fractured kingdoms of medieval Europe. The roads decayed, the stations crumbled, but the memory of motion, a message moving predictably from one official to another, remained powerful. The cursus publicus had created a model not of efficiency, but of authority through documentation. That concept was harder to kill than any empire. The memory of paper paths. In the early Middle Ages, surviving Roman roads were still visible straight lines etched into hillsides, partially paved with old stones. Some were reused as trade routes, others as military corridors. But here and there, records suggest that old postal way stations were repurposed by monks, toll collectors, or regional warlords. In Gaul, the Merovingians recorded collecting imperial tolls at waypoints that matched ancient mutations. In Spain, Visigothic kings issued edicts that had to be carried along the old stone paths. In the Balkans, Byzantine administrators refurbished select Roman post routes to move official messages. No one called it the cursus publicus anymore, but its skeletal outline still cast a shadow. Where the Romans had filed reports in wax and leather, medieval scribes now did so in parchment and scrolls, but the method of transmission was imitative. The idea of paperwork in motion and the bureaucratic trust in its arrival persisted. Byzantium's bureaucratic renaissance. In the East, where the Byzantine Empire carried the Roman legacy for a millennium more, the courier system never quite disappeared. It changed names, forms, and functions, becoming the cursus Armeniacus in the East, the Basilican Dromos, or imperial road under later emperors. Eventually, the tagmata system, where military couriers often substituted for civilian ones. These were slower, leaner, and more flexible than the original Roman design. Instead of vast road networks, the Byzantines used key nodes, major cities, fortified towns, and harbors. Messages were often relayed by sea, which had been underutilized in the old Roman system. The key change, adaptability. Where Rome had tried to control every step, Byzantium learned to trust local knowledge, a concession to a less predictable world. And in doing so, their bureaucracy lasted. Charlemagne's revival attempt. In the 9th century, Charlemagne, crowned emperor of the Romans by the Pope in 800 CE, attempted to revive the grandeur of Roman administration. This included efforts to rebuild the imperial courier system. He introduced missi dominicii, royal envoys tasked with carrying messages, inspecting provinces, and reporting abuses. They weren't quite like the Roman post riders, but they served a similar function: state presence through paperwork. These messengers rode established routes, carried imperial documents, logged their travel and findings, operated under credentialed authority. But their reach was limited. The roads were poor, the distances great, and the bureaucracy fragile. Charlemagne's successors struggled to maintain the system, and it gradually decayed after his death. Still, the aspiration remained. Governance meant messages, and messages required trusted delivery. Echoes in the Habsburgs and Ottomans. Centuries later, during the rise of powerful empires like the Ottomans and the Habsburgs, the Roman model again resurfaced. The Habsburgs, rulers of a patchwork empire not unlike Rome, maintained postal relay systems complete with sealed documentation, official carriers, and fine-grained travel logs. In fact, by the 16th century, their state couriers operated on a network that quite literally followed ancient Roman roads. Some stations were built near or atop the ruins of former mansions. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire maintained its own version of a state courier system, using both mounted riders and river couriers to deliver. Taxation documents, regional census reports, religious decrees, court records. They too grappled with the eternal tension, efficiency versus control. The Ottomans, like Rome before them, gradually drowned in their own documentation. But still they rode. The Enlightenment and the rise of posts. With the advent of more centralized European states in the 17th and 18th centuries, the idea of a state-run postal service for civilians began to emerge. But make no mistake, its administrative DNA was Roman. The British Royal Mail, the Thurn Untaxis postal service in the Holy Roman Empire, and the French Poste Royale all incorporated principles seen centuries earlier. Centralized relay stations, credentialed riders, recorded logs of arrivals and departures, stamped authorizations, regulations on who could send what and when. The difference: these systems were now increasingly used by ordinary people, not just the state. But the legacy of the cursus publicus lingered in the background, a bureaucratic whisper from an empire that no longer existed. Bureaucracy outlasts the empire. Why does this matter? Because when we think of Rome, we imagine architecture, legions, gladiators, and emperors. But we forget that what held it together was paperwork in motion. The cursus publicus was tedious, predictable, overregulated, prone to breakdown, and essential. Without it, the empire could not issue laws, respond to crises, or coordinate its armies. When the post riders stopped arriving, Rome didn't fall immediately, but its voice faded. And when future states arose, they tried again and again to revive that voice, to recreate the miracle of boring communication across distance. The modern echo. Even in the modern era, the traces are visible. Government courier badges, diplomatic pouches, passport stamps, registered mail protocols, bureaucratic authentication seals. These are not conveniences, they are relics of control. You stand in line at the DMV or a passport office and grumble at the paperwork, the wait, the stamps, the regulations. But behind every counter, every form, every scanner, is a shadow of a Roman post rider, galloping down a dusty road with a sealed packet of empire on his hip. We don't resent bureaucracy because it's inefficient. We resent it because it reminds us that empires still exist and that we are inside them. An empire carried by messengers. So much of Roman history is told in terms of emperors and generals, but perhaps the more enduring story is quieter. A man in a tunic, a horse under him, a sealed letter in hand, a stone road ahead, a schedule to keep. He doesn't know the contents of the letter. He doesn't need to. All he knows is that it must arrive. On time. Stamped. Filed. Read. And then forgotten. But the system remembers. The roads remember. And now so do you. Final reflection. The cursus publicus may not be celebrated in marble or myth, but it was one of the most vital systems the Roman world ever produced. It was slow. It was fragile. It was beautiful in its dullness. And in its own dusty way, it helped shape the idea that governments should be able to talk to themselves across time, across distance, across generations. A whisper on horseback, echoing through the centuries. Story 6, The Paper Kingdom, Tax Collectors of the Abbasid Caliphate. A quiet machine in a loud empire. At the height of its power, the Abbasid Caliphate stretched from the shores of the Atlantic in Morocco to the peaks of Persia and the banks of the Indus. Baghdad, its capital, was a metropolis of poets and astronomers, physicians and philosophers. But beneath this world of golden domes and scholarly debate, there ran something quieter, something often overlooked. A meticulous, monotonous, almost mechanical system of taxation. This was the hidden engine of the empire, a complex, slow-moving, detail-obsessed bureaucracy that turned grain into gold, farmers into subjects, and provinces into ledgers. It was called the Diwan al-Kharaj, the Bureau of Land Tax. And it was, in its quiet way, one of the most powerful institutions in the medieval world. Diwan al-Kharaj, the tax office that governed the caliphate. The Diwan al-Kharaj was founded during the Umayyad period, but refined under the Abbasids into a paper-based bureaucratic marvel. It handled the collection, registration, and auditing of land taxes known as kharaj across thousands of settlements. Its clerks were not warriors or theologians, but they held real power. No province could function without their files. No governor could act without their calculations. No army could be paid unless the harvests had been counted, assessed, and taxed. The entire empire balanced on the calculations of a clerk with an ink-stained finger. Mapping the empire by crop. One of the most curious aspects of the Abbasid tax system was its reliance on geometrical land assessment. Fields were measured in jarib, an area unit. Each plot was assigned a productivity grade. Assessors recorded the crop type wheat, barley, dates, cotton, rice, and estimated annual yield. Taxes were levied based on crop and soil productivity, not flat fees. This meant that taxation required accurate maps, field visits, and elaborate documentation. Some provinces maintained agricultural ledgers with hand-drawn field boundaries and notations about flood risk, irrigation channels, or tree density. For a peasant, this might seem like micromanagement. For a tax collector, it was just Tuesday. The surveyor's tools. A tax surveyor in the Abbasid era called a muhassis might travel for weeks across farmlands with a leather satchel of tools. A measuring rope, often knotted at regular intervals. A wax tablet or ink-stained parchment roll. A small reed pen called a kalem. Seals to mark completed assessments. They would stop at each village, inspect fields, talk to local elders, and enter data into regional ledgers. Once finished, these reports were forwarded to Baghdad, where they were reviewed, cross-checked, and stored sometimes for decades. The Abbasids did not forget. Even if the village changed hands, rebelled, or was struck by famine, the original tax expectations remained on file. The role of scribes, the unsung architects. The Abbasid scribes called katibs were more than secretaries. They were the architects of fiscal order. Their job was to take raw data from the field and transform it into structured documents. Annual tax assessments, collection orders, exemption rulings, appeals from overburdened villages. Each scribe worked in a narrow niche. Some handled only irrigation disputes, others specialized in orchard taxation or flood damage claims. Documents were filed by region, crop type, and date an early form of bureaucratic tagging. It's said that some scribes could recite crop yields for an entire province from memory, simply because they had copied the reports so often. They didn't travel, they didn't govern. But without them, the caliphate's revenues would vanish into silence. The language of bureaucracy. Though Arabic was the administrative language of the caliphate, Persian bureaucratic traditions heavily influenced the Diwan al-Kharaj. Many early Abbasid officials were Persian converts to Islam, and they brought with them Sasanian methods of land classification, record-keeping, and taxation formulas. This created a hybrid language of governance. Documents might use Persian phrases for water rights, Arabic for legal terms, Greek-derived numbers for large-scale accounting. The result was a dense, multilingual administrative dialect, not poetic, not inspiring but functional, and in its own way, oddly elegant. Bureaucratic justice, the quiet appeals. Taxation under the Abbasids was not always fair. Errors happened, droughts struck, local officials overreached. But there existed a little-known mechanism for correction, The Diwan appeals system. Farmers or local leaders could send petitions often accompanied by witness signatures or stamped affidavits to district tax bureaus. These would be reviewed by regional scribes and, in some cases, passed to Baghdad for adjudication. These petitions were usually dull. A date grove assessed at too high a rate. A canal silting problem affecting irrigation. Discrepancies in flood damage compensation. But their very existence reflects a crucial fact. The Abbasid bureaucracy acknowledged error. It had room for correction. A slow room, a paper room, but a room nonetheless. Counting the dead. After a plague, it wasn't the physicians who arrived first. It was the tax agents. Villages devastated by disease were still expected to pay unless exemptions were granted. To process this, inspectors would record the number of able-bodied farmers remaining, the acreage that could still be cultivated, the presence or absence of animals and tools. These findings were filed under temporary tax suspension codes. This didn't mean kindness. It meant statistical realism. A sick village couldn't produce wheat. No wheat meant no revenue. So the bureaucracy responded not with emotion, but with adjusted projections. Resistance in the margins. Not everyone complied. Some villages hid their harvests, buried grain in false cellars, or falsified crop types to reduce their tax rate. Others bribed local inspectors to undervalue their fields. The Diwan fought back with audits, spot inspections, cross-referencing with previous year's yield logs. In one 9th century case from the archives of Wasit, a village that had declared drought for 3 consecutive years was visited by an auditor who discovered thriving fig orchards behind a hidden canal. The village was fined, its elders jailed. But not for rebellion, for paper fraud. In the Abbasid system, lying on a tax report was more serious than armed resistance. Rebellion could be forgiven, falsified figures, never. When the paper fails, occasionally bureaucracy broke down. Wars, uprisings, or administrative overhauls disrupted the system. In some periods, tax documents disappeared entirely from provincial archives. Revenue dropped, soldiers went unpaid, infrastructure stalled. But what's striking is how quickly the Diwan restored itself. Like a living organism, it regrew its missing parts. Scribes were recalled, ledgers recopied, tax maps redrawn. Baghdad did not trust memory, it trusted files. And if the files burned, they were reconstructed. From copies, from notes, from fragments found in private homes or border towns. The Abbasids understood something modern systems often forget. Paper doesn't forget, it just gets lost. Ending thought for Section 1. What does it say about a civilization that its most enduring creation is not a poem, a palace, or a prophet but a tax form? If paperwork builds an empire, does forgetting how to file bring it down? The paper trail that spoke louder than gold. In the Abbasid world, wealth did not glitter in coins or shine in silks. It rustled in bundles of parchment, whispered through ledgers, and stacked quietly in the offices of provincial administrators. The Diwan al-Kharaj had grown not just into a system, but into a way of life. Every field tilled, every date harvested, every canal repaired had a corresponding record, stored neatly in folders that, collectively, defined the rhythms of an empire. But as the empire expanded and aged, so too did the cracks in this paper kingdom. The Abbasids had mastered the science of taxation. But they were still human. When tax became a private venture, in the 9th century under Caliph al-Mu'tasim, a new trend emerged, the rise of tax farming known as iqta. Instead of collecting taxes directly, the central government began outsourcing revenue collection to private individuals, often military officers or loyal nobles, in exchange for upfront payments or political loyalty. These tax farmers were granted control over specific lands and allowed to keep a portion, or even all, of the tax revenues after paying a fixed amount to the state. On paper, this was a solution to bureaucracy's inefficiencies. In practice, it opened the door to abuse. The predator in the ledger. An honest tax farmer might collect only what was owed and invest in local infrastructure to boost long-term revenue, but many were predatory. Some inflated harvest estimates to justify higher collections, used brutal enforcers to coerce payment, falsified audits to avoid scrutiny from Baghdad, bribed or blackmailed Diwan scribe to forge exemption documents. One notorious tax farmer in Khuzestan collected triple the assessed amount during a drought year and still filed documents declaring favorable growing conditions. Villages collapsed, fields were abandoned, appeals flooded the Diwan. And yet the documents were immaculate. The system didn't collapse from a lack of records. It collapsed under perfectly falsified ones. The Diwan's countermeasures. The central Diwan in Baghdad wasn't powerless. In response to widespread abuse, it launched investigative audits, sending trusted officials known as muhasabun account inspectors to remote regions. These inspectors traveled with copies of old ledgers, maps, and prior assessments, cross-checking reported yields versus actual harvests, tax rates versus official guidelines, public complaints versus ledger entries. When discrepancies were found, the consequences were serious. Officials could be removed or imprisoned. Entire regions might be placed under direct Diwan control. Tax records could be invalidated and reissued from Baghdad. In some cases, villagers themselves were trained to help copy and verify ledgers, creating an early form of distributed record-keeping. Still, the system's strength was also its weakness, its reliance on human honesty inside a mountain of paper. Bureaucracy as a form of resistance. Not all corruption came from the top. Sometimes the bureaucrats themselves rebelled quietly with ink. In one documented case from the 870s, a Diwan scribe in Mosul, angered by the unjust treatment of a village family, delayed the processing of their tax arrears form. This delay prevented their land from being confiscated. The scribe then discovered an older exemption order, long expired, and retroactively applied it to their file. The family kept their land. It wasn't legal. It wasn't even rare. Across the Abbasid world, clerks used delays, omissions, ambiguous phrasing, or quiet reinterpretations of policy to reshape outcomes not with swords, but with stamps. The language of loopholes. The Abbasid bureaucracy, like all sophisticated paper empires, developed its own language of ambiguity. A simple form could include multiple date formats, lunar and solar, subjective productivity terms, average yield versus strong yield, fields left intentionally blank for later interpretation. Clerks and tax farmers learned to manipulate this language. A field left fallow for religious reasons could be labeled temporarily exempt or ritually suspended. A loss due to flood could be natural disaster or management error. A disputed land boundary might be filed as pending arbitration, a phrase that meant nothing and everything. In a world governed by forms, words were weapons, and bureaucrats were their quiet wielders. The geography of control. Certain provinces became synonymous with corruption, not due to moral failure, but due to distance and complexity. Khorasan, on the empire's far eastern edge, was vast, multilingual, and difficult to supervise. Egypt, though wealthy, was often administered by semi-independent governors. Yemen, mountainous and isolated, had its own taxation traditions that resisted standardization. The further a region was from Baghdad, the more likely it was to evolve its own shadow bureaucracy. Some even maintained duplicate ledgers, one set for internal use, another cleaned for submission to Baghdad. Yet these regions weren't rogue states. They still filed reports, still paid tribute. They simply played the game differently. When bureaucracy shapes identity, over time, the very act of being taxed began to define status. Landowners with complete records were considered legitimate. Villages with Diwan exemptions earned official recognition. Individuals with long paper trails could prove generational ownership, inheritance rights, or community leadership. In short, to exist legally in the Abbasid world was to be documented. This created a strange culture in which farmers learned to file, elders preserved receipts, and scribes became family assets. In some regions, marriages were only considered legitimate if registered with the tax office, since property division and inheritance were linked to Diwan records. In others, a man's social worth was defined not by wealth, but by how orderly his land files were kept. Paperwork didn't just reflect reality. It created it. Bureaucratic memory and revenge. In an unusual episode from the early 10th century, a former provincial governor attempted to reclaim land he had sold decades earlier. He submitted a forged tax record and a fabricated survey map. The local Diwan official, however, remembered the original case. He pulled the old files water-damaged, but intact and cross-referenced signatures, crop records, and field shapes. The forgery was exposed. The governor was fined and publicly humiliated. But what's notable here isn't the justice, it's the power of memory embedded in documentation. The paper had remembered what people had tried to forget. And that memory had teeth. The slow unraveling. By the late 10th century, the Abbasid Caliphate was weakening. Military uprisings, regional rebellions, and the growing independence of provincial powers like the Buyids in Persia or the Fatimids in Egypt fractured central authority. And yet the Diwan al-Kharaj continued. Tax forms were filed, fields assessed, ledgers copied. In some ways, the bureaucracy outlasted the caliphate itself, becoming a floating infrastructure inherited by successor states. Baghdad might burn, caliphs might die. But the field survey reports from Wasit, still in the drawer. Ending question for Section 2. If power lies not in armies or titles, but in the quiet filing of a form, then who truly rules those who give the orders or those who record them? And when the empire fades, what becomes of the ink? The bureaucracy without a caliph. By the beginning of the 11th century, the Abbasid Caliphate had shrunk. Baghdad still held the caliphate's name, but power had shifted to warlords, regional dynasties, and military elites. The Buyids ruled in Persia. The Fatimids in Egypt declared a rival caliph, and Turkish generals held real control in many cities. And yet somehow, the Diwan al-Kharaj survived. Not because it was defended, but because it was useful. No matter who held the sword, someone had to balance the ledgers. Grain had to be weighed. Canals needed inspection. Taxes required a signature. And the scribes, those quiet architects of imperial continuity, kept doing their jobs. Even when the empire fractured, its files remained intact. Like the bones of a dead colossus, the bureaucracy lingered. Scribes under new masters. After the Buyids took de facto control of Baghdad in 945 CE, one of their first actions was not to dismiss the scribes or dissolve the Diwan. Instead, they restructured it. They appointed their own administrators but left the paperwork system largely intact. Why? Because it worked. It was slow, yes, but consistent. The Diwan was less a tool of ideology and more a machine of habit. Tax forms were updated with new seals. Regional offices, were instructed to send ledgers to different governors. Some languages shifted, some titles changed, but the paper flow remained the same. This continuity reveals a truth. Empires may fall, but bureaucracies rarely retire. They adapt quietly. The Fatimids and the Abbasid legacy. Meanwhile, in Egypt, the Fatimids, claiming a Shia lineage separate from the Sunni Abbasids, built their own government in Cairo. And yet, when establishing their tax administration, they borrowed heavily from Abbasid models. They created land registries, modeled on Diwan al-Kharaj methods. Their clerks trained with Abbasid scribes. Survey protocols, crop classification systems, and exemption formats mirrored those used in Baghdad. Even in rejection, Abbasid bureaucracy was imitated. It had become the template for Islamic governance, not because it was glorious, but because it was functional, measurable, and adaptable. A clerk's testament. In a rare surviving letter from a 10th century scribe in the city of Wasit, we find a window into the lived experience of bureaucratic life. I am not a man of war nor of commerce. I have copied the same field report 14 times. Each year the orchard floods, and each year I file the same exception. The dates do not change, but I must write them again, for the file must be complete. I am the record, not the reader. This quiet humility captures the soul of the Abbasid system. No fanfare, no rebellion. Just repetition. And through that repetition, order. The limits of the system. Despite its longevity, the Abbasid bureaucracy was not invincible. Over time, three key factors began to erode its reliability. Over-centralization. As more power shifted to local rulers, the Diwan's ability to enforce consistent taxation weakened. Provinces stopped submitting accurate data or withheld reports altogether. Military privilege. Increasingly, military commanders were exempted from taxation, either by force or by royal decree. This shrank the tax base and distorted the ledgers. Inflation of titles. As paper became symbolic, titles and exemptions were sold or gifted, flooding the system with fake officials and phantom exemptions. The system still processed paper, but the paper no longer reflected reality. And when bureaucracy loses contact with reality, it doesn't scream. It just keeps filing. Fire and flood. The greatest threat to the Abbasid paper machine was not rebellion or fraud, but disaster. In 1258, the Mongols sacked Baghdad. They destroyed palaces, libraries, hospitals, and the great record halls of the Diwan. Documents, some centuries old, were burned or thrown into the Tigris River. Eyewitnesses claimed the river ran black with ink. It wasn't just knowledge that was lost. It was memory. The yield logs, the field maps, the exemption lists, the forgotten appeals, the quiet history of every farmer, every canal, every dispute over irrigation or taxation gone. The destruction of the Diwan's archives wasn't just cultural loss. It was administrative annihilation. Without records, the system could not rebuild. Bureaucratic orphans, what came after? And yet, the Abbasid bureaucracy did not fully die. Like spores from a fallen tree, its methods spread. The Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt rebuilt its own Diwan system using surviving fragments of Abbasid methods. The Ottoman Empire would later model its tax system, the Tahrir Defterleri, or land registers on Abbasid ideas. Even in Mughal India, the Zabt system under Akbar reflected echoes of Abbasid classification logic. Every time a new Islamic state emerged, it rediscovered bureaucracy, and almost always, the Abbasid template reappeared. Not because it was enforced, because it was remembered. Legacy in ink. Today, few Abbasid tax records survive. Most were lost to time, fire, or neglect. But fragments remain, in stone inscriptions, quotations in legal manuals, and in the habits of successor bureaucracies. Modern historians, sifting through faded parchments and worn-out seals, find in these details a strange kind of immortality. Because while empires rise and fall, the act of recording endures. The Abbasid tax collector may be forgotten by name, but his system, his patience, his rope-measuring surveys, his hand-copied exemptions lives on in every filing cabinet, every government ledger, every stamped form. A final scene. Imagine, if you will, a lone scribe in the fading twilight of the Abbasid era. He sits on a woven mat, reed pen in hand. The scroll before him lists the yield of a barley field in a village that no longer exists. He knows the empire is fatting. He's heard rumors of Mongols, of rebellion, of the caliph's failing health. But the harvest must still be filed. He dips his pen. He writes. Final reflection. Bureaucracy is rarely heroic. Its stories are slow, repetitive, easily overlooked. But behind every empire lies someone who measured the fields, someone who filed the petition, someone who wrote the yield in the correct column. The Abbasid tax system was not just about money. It was about memory, legitimacy, and quiet continuity. And though the caliphate fell, the echoes of its paper kingdom still shape the administrative worlds we live in.